Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to journey across the steppes of time, through the dust of 1,000 battlefields, and into the heart of the greatest land empire the world has ever known. We're going to explore how a collection of scattered tribes living in felt tents beneath an endless sky became the architects of conquest on a scale that still takes your breath away. This is the story of the Mongol Empire. Not just the battles, not just the bloodshed, but the deeper currents that carried these nomadic peoples from the windswept grasslands of Mongolia to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the tropical shores of Java. It's a story of ambition and brutality, of genius and destruction, of how a single man's vision of unity became the force that connected East and West for the first time in human history. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you about the storm that changed everything. Picture, if you will, the Mongolian steppes in the year 1162, an ocean of grass stretching beyond the horizon, broken only by the occasional river valley or rocky outcrop. The sky here isn't just big, it's infinite. A dome of blue so vast it makes you feel like a speck of dust in the cosmic wind. This is a land that shapes souls, that breeds a particular kind of hardness, a particular kind of hunger. The wind never stops here. It carries the scent of wild grass and horse sweat, the distant cry of eagles, the whispered promises of horizons that seem to retreat as you approach them. In winter, it brings snow that can bury a man and his horse in minutes. In summer, it brings dust storms that turn day into night and strip the flesh from exposed skin. This is not a gentle land, not a forgiving one. It is a place that demands everything from those who would call it home. Into this world, in a felt tent no different from thousands of others scattered across the grasslands, a child was born. His father, Yasuge, was a minor chieftain of the Kiad clan, one of many Mongol tribes that spent their days herding sheep and horses, their nights telling stories around fires that flickered like stars fallen to earth. They named the boy Temüjin, after a Tatar warrior his father had recently captured, a name that carried the weight of victory and the promise of future conquests. But this was no ordinary birth, at least not according to the stories that would grow around it like legends around a flame. They say the child was born clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, a sign that he would one day spill rivers of blood. They say his eyes held a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the mortal world, a fire that burned with the intensity of the eternal blue sky itself. Whether these tales are true or simply the kind of mythology that gathers around great men like morning mist, we'll never know. But what we do know is this. From his very first breath, Temüjin was breathing the air of a world at war with itself. The Mongolia of his childhood was not a nation. It was a patchwork of tribes: Mongols, Tatars, Karaites, Naimans, each one suspicious of the others, each one ready to raid, to steal horses, to take revenge for some slight that might have happened generations ago. It was a world where strength was the only law, where weakness meant death, where a man's worth was measured not in gold or land, but in the loyalty of his followers and the speed of his horse. The tribal structure was ancient, rooted in customs that stretched back to the dawn of time on the steppes. Each clan claimed descent from a legendary ancestor, usually a wolf or an eagle, or some other creature of power and freedom. These totemic animals were more than symbols. They were spiritual guides, sources of strength and identity that bound the scattered families together in webs of obligation and honor. But honor on the steppes was a double-edged sword. It demanded loyalty to one's kinsmen, but it also demanded vengeance against one's enemies. A slight against one member of a clan was a slight against all, and debts of blood could be passed down from father to son for generations. This cycle of revenge and counter-revenge kept the tribes in a constant state of low-level warfare, preventing them from uniting against common enemies or pursuing larger ambitions. The economy of the steppes was based on mobility and adaptation. The Mongols were pastoralists, following their herds of horses, sheep, goats, and cattle across the grasslands in search of fresh pasture and water. They lived in felt tents called gers, circular structures that could be assembled or disassembled in less than an hour, allowing entire communities to move at a moment's notice. This nomadic lifestyle created a people uniquely suited for warfare. Every Mongol man was a horseman from childhood, capable of riding for days without rest, of shooting arrows with deadly accuracy while at full gallop, of living on mare's milk and dried meat when necessary. They were not farmers tied to the land or craftsmen bound to their workshops. They were free to move wherever opportunity or necessity called them. But freedom came at a price. The steppes were harsh and unforgiving, offering little margin for error. A harsh winter could kill thousands of animals and leave entire tribes on the brink of starvation. A drought could dry up the water sources that made life possible. Raiders from neighboring tribes could steal the herds that represented a family's entire wealth in a single night. Temüjin learned these lessons early and hard. When he was just 9 years old, his father was poisoned by Tatar enemies at a feast, a betrayal that would shape the boy's understanding of trust and treachery for the rest of his life. The boy returned home to find his world collapsing. Without Yesuge's protection, the family was abandoned by their own clan, left to survive on the harsh steppes with nothing but their wits and their will to live. Imagine it. A widow and her children, cast out into a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak. They ate roots and fish, wore rags, lived like outcasts on the edges of a society that had no place for them. Temüjin's mother, Hoelin, became the center of their small universe, a woman of iron will who refused to let her family surrender to despair. She taught her children that survival was not just about staying alive. It was about maintaining dignity, about preparing for the day when they would reclaim their rightful place in the world. But in that crucible of abandonment and hunger, something else was being forged. Temüjin was learning that the world owed him nothing, that everything he would ever have, he would have to take with his own hands. He was learning to read the subtle signs of weather and terrain, to track animals and enemies across vast distances, to judge character and motivation with the precision of a master hunter. The steppes were teaching him their first and most important lesson, that survival belongs to those who refuse to surrender, no matter how dark the night becomes. But they were also teaching him something more, that the traditional ways, the ancient customs that had governed steppe life for centuries, were not sacred truths, but human constructions that could be changed, improved, or discarded entirely if they stood in the way of success. This was perhaps the most radical idea that would emerge from Temüjin's childhood, that tradition was not destiny, that a man could remake himself and his world if he had the vision and the will to do so. It was an idea that would eventually reshape not just the steppes, but the entire world. The young man who emerged from those years of exile was not the same boy who had ridden away from his father's funeral. Temüjin had grown tall and lean, with eyes that seemed to see through men's souls, and a voice that could command attention in any gathering. But more than that, he had developed something that would prove more valuable than any sword or bow, an understanding of power that went deeper than mere force. The traditional Mongol way of leadership was based on birth, age, and the accumulated weight of custom. Chiefs inherited their positions from their fathers, and their authority was limited by the expectations of their followers and the constraints of tribal law. It was a system that valued stability over innovation, consensus over decisive action, But Temüjin had learned different lessons during his years of exile. He had seen how quickly fortune could change, how the mighty could fall, and the lowly could rise. He had learned that loyalty based on fear or tradition was fragile, but loyalty based on mutual benefit and shared vision could move mountains. He began to gather followers, not through birthright or inherited authority, but through something far more dangerous: charisma mixed with competence. He understood that in a world of shifting tribal loyalties, a leader needed to offer more than just protection. He needed to offer hope, purpose, a vision of something better than the endless cycle of raid and revenge that had defined steppe life for centuries. His first great insight was this: merit should matter more than blood. In the traditional Mongol way, positions of authority went to relatives, to the sons of chiefs, regardless of their ability. Temüjin began promoting men based on their skills, their loyalty, their results. A shepherd who showed tactical brilliance could become a general. A blacksmith who proved trustworthy could become an advisor. It was revolutionary, and it worked. This meritocratic approach attracted men who had been overlooked or undervalued by the traditional system. Jebe, who would become one of Temüjin's greatest generals, was originally an enemy archer who had wounded Temüjin's horse in battle. Instead of executing him, Temüjin recognized his skill and offered him a place in his army. Subutai, perhaps the greatest military strategist of the medieval period, was the son of a blacksmith who rose through the ranks based purely on his tactical genius. His second insight was even more radical. Enemies could become allies. Instead of simply destroying those who opposed him, Temüjin began incorporating defeated tribes into his growing confederation. He would spare the lives of enemy warriors who showed courage, adopt their children, marry their daughters to his sons. He was building something unprecedented on the steppes, not just a tribe, but a nation. This policy of integration rather than extermination was both pragmatic and visionary. Pragmatically, it allowed Temüjin to grow his forces without depleting them through constant warfare. Visionary, it pointed toward a future where the artificial divisions between tribes could be transcended in favor of a larger identity based on shared purpose rather than shared ancestry. But integration was not the same as assimilation. Temüjin understood that different groups brought different strengths to his confederation. The Merkits were skilled in river warfare. The Naimans had experience with siege techniques learned from Chinese engineers. The Karaites had connections to the wider world through their Christian faith. Rather than forcing everyone to become identical, he created a system that could harness diversity as a source of strength. The process was neither quick nor easy. For decades, Temüjin fought a complex web of alliances and betrayals, victories and defeats. He was captured and enslaved by the Temüjin, escaping only through a combination of luck and the help of sympathetic guards. He made alliances with powerful Khans like Togrul of the Karaites and Jamuka, his childhood friend who would become his greatest rival. The relationship with Jamuka was particularly complex and painful. The two men had been blood brothers in their youth, bound by oaths that were supposed to be unbreakable. But as they both rose to prominence, their different visions of the future put them on a collision course. Jamuka represented the traditional way, the preservation of tribal autonomy and the ancient customs that had governed steppe life for generations. Temüjin represented something new, the possibility of unity under a single authority, of transcending the limitations that had kept the Mongols weak and divided. Their final confrontation came in 1206 at the Battle of Dalen Baljut. It was more than a military engagement. It was a contest between two different ideas of what the Mongol people could become. Jamuka's forces were larger and included many traditional allies, but Temüjin's army was more disciplined and motivated by a clearer sense of purpose. The battle itself was decided by defections. Many of Jamuka's followers, seeing the writing on the wall, switched sides at the crucial moment. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout Temüjin's career. His enemies often defeated themselves through their inability to inspire the same level of loyalty that he commanded. After his victory, Temüjin faced a crucial decision about what to do with Jamuka. According to steppe custom, he could have executed his former friend or enslaved him. Instead, he offered him a place in his confederation, a chance to serve the vision of Mongol unity that was taking shape. Jamuka refused, choosing death over submission, but his refusal was itself a kind of recognition, an acknowledgement that Temüjin represented something genuinely new and transformative. The execution of Jamuka was carried out according to his wishes, without spilling blood, a mark of respect for a worthy enemy. But it also marked the end of the old way of doing things on the steppes. The age of tribal autonomy was over. The age of Mongol unity was about to begin. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, the scattered tribes of Mongolia did something they had never done before. They chose a single leader, a great Khan, to rule over all of them. They chose Temüjin, and they gave him a new name that would echo through history like thunder across the steppes, Genghis Khan, which meant universal ruler. The ceremony was both ancient and revolutionary. Ancient in its use of traditional rituals and symbols, the white felt carpet on which the new Khan was raised, the 9 white banners that represented the eternal blue sky, the sacred fire that connected the earthly realm to the divine. Revolutionary in its implications. For the first time in their history, the Mongol tribes were acknowledging a single authority that transcended clan and tribal boundaries. He was 44 years old, no longer young by the standards of his time. But he was just getting started. The unification of Mongolia was not an end, but a beginning, the first step in a journey that would carry Mongol armies to the ends of the known world. What drove Genghis Khan? What fire burned in the heart of this man who would reshape the world? To understand the Mongol conquests, we need to understand the mind behind them, the worldview that turned a tribal confederation into an unstoppable force of nature. Genghis Khan believed in destiny, but not the passive kind that waits for fate to unfold. He believed in destiny that had to be seized, carved out of the world through will and action. He saw himself as the instrument of Tengri, the eternal blue sky that was the supreme deity of the Mongols. But this wasn't mere religious fanaticism. It was something more complex, more dangerous. The concept of Tengri was central to Mongol spirituality and political philosophy. Unlike the anthropomorphic gods of settled civilizations, Tengri was not a being, but a principle, the source of all authority, the foundation of all order, the ultimate reality that lay behind the visible world. To be chosen by Tengri was not just to receive divine favor, but to become an agent of cosmic purpose. This belief gave Genghis Khan and his followers a sense of mission that went far beyond mere conquest. They were not just seeking wealth or territory. They were fulfilling a divine mandate to bring order to a chaotic world. Every victory was proof of Tengri's favor. Every defeat was a sign that they had strayed from the righteous path. But Genghis Khan's understanding of divine will was remarkably practical. He believed that Tengri helped those who helped themselves, that divine favor had to be earned through courage, intelligence, and relentless effort. He was deeply suspicious of those who claimed special religious authority or who tried to use supernatural explanations to avoid hard work and clear thinking. This pragmatic spirituality shaped every aspect of Mongol culture and military organization. The Mongols were tolerant of other religions, not because they were indifferent to spiritual matters, but because they believed that all genuine religious traditions were different paths to the same ultimate truth. A Christian who fought bravely and served loyally was as worthy of respect as a Buddhist or a Muslim or a traditional shamanist. He believed that the world was meant to be unified under one ruler, that the endless divisions between peoples and nations were an affront to the natural order. In his mind, he wasn't conquering, he was healing, bringing order to chaos, creating the peace that could only come through absolute victory. This philosophy of universal empire was not unique to Genghis Khan. It had appeared in various forms throughout history, from Alexander the Great to the Roman Caesars to the Chinese emperors. But the Mongol version was distinctive in its combination of pragmatism and idealism, its willingness to adapt to local conditions while maintaining a clear sense of ultimate purpose. The Mongol vision of world order was based on several key principles. First, that all peoples were fundamentally equal in their capacity for civilization and their right to just treatment. Second, that diversity of culture and religion was a source of strength rather than weakness. Third, that merit should be the primary criterion for advancement and authority. Fourth, that trade and communication should flow freely across political boundaries. These principles were revolutionary in a world dominated by rigid hierarchies based on birth, ethnicity, and religious orthodoxy. The Mongol Empire would become the first truly multicultural state in world history, a political entity that encompassed dozens of different peoples and traditions under a single authority. This philosophy shaped everything about Mongol warfare. They didn't just want to defeat their enemies. They wanted to absorb them, to make them part of something larger. Surrender was always an option, but it had to be complete, unconditional. Those who submitted were welcomed into the Mongol system, often with their existing leaders intact. Those who resisted faced annihilation so complete that their cities became cautionary tales whispered around campfires for generations. The Mongol military machine that Genghis Khan created was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was built on mobility, discipline, and a kind of tactical flexibility that could adapt to any enemy, any terrain, any situation. The basic unit was the Tumen, 10,000 mounted warriors organized in a decimal system that allowed for incredible coordination and control. But the decimal system was more than just military organization. It was a social revolution. Traditional Mongol society had been organized around kinship groups and tribal affiliations. The decimal system cut across these traditional boundaries, creating new loyalties based on military service rather than blood relationships. A man's primary identity was no longer as a member of the Merkid tribe or the Carrot clan, but as a member of the 100 or 1,000 to which he had been assigned. This reorganization had profound psychological effects. It broke down the parochial loyalties that had kept the Mongol tribes divided and created a new sense of identity based on shared service to the Great Khan and the Mongol nation. It also created opportunities for advancement that had never existed before. A talented warrior could rise through the ranks regardless of his tribal background or family connections. The training and discipline of Mongol warriors was legendary. From childhood, every Mongol male learned to ride, to shoot, to hunt, to endure hardship without complaint. But beyond these individual skills, they learned to function as part of a larger organism, to coordinate their actions with thousands of others, to execute complex maneuvers with precision and speed. The great hunts that Genghis Khan organized were more than recreational activities. They were military exercises on a massive scale. Thousands of warriors would spread out across hundreds of miles of steppe, forming a vast circle that gradually contracted, driving all the game within it toward a central killing ground. These hunts required perfect coordination, absolute discipline, and the ability to maintain formation across terrain that would challenge the most experienced cavalry. When the Mongols adapted this technique to warfare, The results were devastating. Enemy armies found themselves surrounded by forces that seemed to appear from nowhere, harried by arrows shot from horseback at full gallop, unable to close with an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the traditional manner. But the real secret of Mongol success wasn't their organization, it was their mindset. These were men who had grown up on horseback, who could ride for days without rest, who could live on mare's milk and dried meat, who saw the entire world as their pasture. They weren't fighting for gold or glory in the traditional sense. They were fighting for their Khan, for their brothers, for a vision of universal empire that made every sacrifice meaningful, and they were absolutely ruthless. The Mongols understood that terror was a weapon as sharp as any sword. Cities that surrendered were spared. Cities that resisted were obliterated, their populations slaughtered or enslaved, their buildings razed so thoroughly that grass would grow where streets had been. It was a calculated brutality designed to make the next city think twice before closing its gates. This systematic use of terror was not sadism but strategy. The Mongols understood that the fear of their approach could be more effective than actual violence. A city that surrendered without a fight saved both sides the costs of a siege. A population that submitted willingly could be integrated into the Mongol system and become a source of strength rather than a drain on resources. The psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield. The Mongols were masters of intelligence gathering and disinformation. They would send spies and merchants ahead of their armies to spread rumors, to identify potential allies and enemies, to map out the political and economic landscape of their targets. By the time the Mongol army appeared on the horizon, they often knew more about their enemies than their enemies knew about themselves. By 1209, Genghis Khan felt ready to test his unified Mongolia against the wider world. His first target was the Western Xia, a kingdom that controlled the Silk Road trade routes through what is now northwestern China. It was a logical choice, wealthy, strategically important, but not so powerful as to be impossible to defeat. The Western Xia was a Tangut kingdom that had grown rich from trade and tribute. Its capital, Zhongxing, was a cosmopolitan city where Chinese, Tibetan, and Central Asian cultures mingled. The kingdom's military was based on Chinese models, with heavily armored cavalry and infantry formations supported by crossbowmen and siege engines. But the Western Xia had grown complacent behind their walls and their wealth. They had not faced a serious military challenge in generations, and their forces were more suited to ceremonial parades than actual combat. When the Mongol army appeared on their borders, they assumed it was just another nomadic raid that could be bought off with tribute or defeated by superior numbers and equipment. The campaign was a masterpiece of Mongol tactics. Instead of besieging the heavily fortified cities, the Mongols swept around them, cutting off trade routes, destroying the agricultural infrastructure that supported urban life. They forced the Western Xia to fight on Mongol terms, mobile warfare in open country where their cavalry superiority was absolute. The psychological impact was as important as the military one. The Western Xia had never faced an enemy like this, one that could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Their confidence in their defenses crumbled as Mongol raiders penetrated deep into their territory, burning crops, capturing livestock, and demonstrating that no place was safe from their reach. The siege of Zhongxing itself became a lesson in Mongol adaptability. When traditional steppe tactics proved insufficient against the city's massive walls, Genghis Khan recruited Chinese engineers who had defected to his cause. He learned the arts of siege warfare, of catapults and battering rams and undermining walls. He showed that the Mongols were not just raiders but learners, capable of absorbing and improving upon any military technology they encountered. But more than that, he understood something that the Western Xia defenders did not, that cities, for all their walls and weapons, were ultimately vulnerable because they depended on the countryside around them. The Mongols systematically destroyed the agricultural base that supported Zhongxing, cutting off food supplies, disrupting trade, making the great city into a prison for its own inhabitants. When the Western Xia finally submitted in 1209, it was not because their walls had been breached, but because their will had been broken. The kingdom agreed to pay tribute, to provide troops for future Mongol campaigns, and to acknowledge Genghis Khan as their overlord. It was a complete victory achieved with minimal Mongol casualties, a template for the conquests that would follow. The message was clear. The age of the steppes had begun. The scattered tribes of Mongolia had been forged into a weapon that could crack open the greatest cities of the settled world. But this was only the beginning. To the south lay the greatest prize in East Asia. The Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China and commanded resources that dwarfed anything the Mongols had ever imagined. To the south of Mongolia lay the greatest prize in East Asia, the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China and commanded resources that dwarfed anything the Mongols had ever imagined. Here were cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands, agricultural systems that could feed millions, workshops that produced silk and porcelain and steel of legendary quality. The Jin dynasty was ruled by the Yurchen people, a semi-nomadic group that had conquered northern China in the early 12th century, overthrowing the Song dynasty and establishing their own imperial system. In many ways, they were not unlike the Mongols, originally nomadic warriors who had adapted to ruling a settled population. But by the time Genghis Khan turned his attention southward, the Jin had been in power for nearly a century, and they had grown comfortable with their role as inheritors of Chinese civilization. The Jurchen elite had adopted Chinese customs, Chinese luxuries, Chinese assumptions about warfare. They lived in palaces filled with silk and jade, surrounded themselves with Chinese scholars and artists, and had largely abandoned the martial traditions that had brought them to power. They saw the Mongols as just another barbarian tribe from the north, troublesome perhaps, but hardly a threat to the mandate of heaven. This cultural transformation was both a strength and a weakness. It gave the Jin access to the accumulated wisdom and resources of Chinese civilization, but it also made them vulnerable to the same complacency that had allowed them to conquer China in the first place. They had forgotten that empires built by the sword must be maintained by the sword, that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would destroy it. The Jin military system was based on Chinese models, with some adaptations for the Yurchen background of the ruling elite. The core of their army consisted of heavily armored cavalry, supported by infantry formations armed with crossbows and pikes. They had developed sophisticated siege techniques and had access to early forms of gunpowder weapons, including primitive cannons and explosive devices. But their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, their reliance on static defenses. The Jin had inherited from the Chinese a preference for fighting from behind walls, for using fortifications to channel and defeat enemy attacks. This approach had worked well against traditional nomadic raids, which typically lacked the patience and resources for extended sieges. The Mongols, however, were not traditional nomads. They had learned from their campaign against the Western Xia that walls could be overcome through patience, intelligence, and the systematic application of pressure. More importantly, they had learned that the real strength of settled civilizations lay not in their fortifications, but in their economic systems, the complex networks of trade and agriculture that supported urban life. They were catastrophically wrong about the nature of the threat they faced. In 1211, Genghis Khan launched his invasion of Jin territory. What followed was not just a military campaign, but a collision between two completely different ways of understanding the world. The Chinese fought from behind walls, relying on static defenses and the assumption that barbarians would eventually exhaust themselves against superior civilization. The Mongols fought like a force of nature, flowing around obstacles, striking where least expected, turning the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The initial Mongol strategy was to avoid the heavily fortified cities and concentrate on destroying the economic infrastructure that supported them. Mongol raiders swept across the North China Plain, burning crops, destroying irrigation systems, capturing livestock, and disrupting the trade routes that connected the cities to each other and to the outside world. This approach had several advantages. It played to Mongol strengths in mobile warfare, while avoiding their weaknesses in siegecraft. It maximized the psychological impact of their presence while minimizing their casualties. And it gradually weakened the Jin ability to resist by cutting off the resources that sustained their military and administrative systems. The Jin response was predictable, but ineffective. They concentrated their forces in the major cities and waited for the Mongol storm to pass. They assumed that the nomads would eventually run out of supplies or grow tired of campaigning and return to their grasslands. They failed to understand that this was not a raid, but a conquest, not a temporary disruption, but a permanent transformation. As the months passed and the Mongol pressure continued, cracks began to appear in the Jin system. Cities that had been cut off from their agricultural hinterlands began to experience food shortages. Trade networks that had operated for centuries were disrupted. The tax revenues that supported the imperial government began to decline as economic activity ground to a halt. The siege of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, became the symbol of this clash between civilizations. The city was massive, heavily fortified, defended by thousands of soldiers, and protected by walls that had never been breached. The Jin commanders were confident that the Mongols, lacking siege equipment and engineering knowledge, would eventually give up and retreat to their grasslands. Zhongdu was not just a city, but a symbol of Chinese civilization itself. It had been the capital of the Liao dynasty before the Jin conquest, and it represented the accumulated wealth and culture of northern China. Its walls were 30 feet high and 15 feet thick, built of rammed earth and faced with brick. Its gates were protected by massive towers and defended by the latest military technology. The city's population was estimated at over 1 million people, making it one of the largest urban centers in the world at that time. Within its walls were palaces and temples, markets and workshops, libraries and schools. It was a microcosm of Chinese civilization, a place where the highest achievements of human culture were preserved and celebrated. But Zhongdu was also a trap. Its very size and complexity made it vulnerable to the kind of systematic pressure that the Mongols were expert at applying. The city required enormous quantities of food and supplies to sustain its population, and these had to be brought in from the surrounding countryside. When the Mongols cut off these supply lines, the great city began to starve. Instead, Genghis Khan demonstrated the adaptability that would become the hallmark of Mongol warfare. He recruited Chinese engineers who had defected to his cause, men who understood the principles of siege warfare and could teach the Mongols how to build and operate the complex machines needed to breach city walls. He learned the arts of siege warfare, of catapults and battering rams and undermining walls. He showed that the Mongols were not just raiders but learners, capable of absorbing and improving upon any military technology they encountered. The defection of Chinese engineers and administrators was a crucial factor in Mongol success. These men brought with them not just technical knowledge, but intimate understanding of Chinese society, politics, and military organization. They could identify weak points in enemy defenses, predict how Chinese commanders would respond to different threats, and help the Mongols adapt their tactics to local conditions. But more than that, he understood something that the Jin defenders did not, that cities, for all their walls and weapons, were ultimately vulnerable because they depended on the countryside around them. The Mongols systematically destroyed the agricultural base that supported Zhongdu, cutting off food supplies, disrupting trade, making the great city into a prison for its own inhabitants. The siege lasted for more than a year, from 1213 to 1215. During this time, the Mongols gradually tightened their grip on the city, building their own fortifications to prevent sorties, constructing siege engines to batter the walls, and maintaining constant pressure on the defenders. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical siege. The Mongols made sure that the defenders could see the smoke from burning villages in the distance, could hear the reports of refugees fleeing the devastation in the countryside. They wanted the people of Zhengdu to understand that their world was ending, that the old certainties were crumbling, that their only choice was between surrender and annihilation. Inside the city, conditions gradually deteriorated. Food became scarce, then rare, then almost non-existent. Disease spread through the crowded streets. Morale collapsed as it became clear that no relief force was coming, that the Jin government had effectively abandoned the city to its fate. When Zhengdu finally fell in 1215, after a siege that lasted more than a year, the psychological impact was enormous. This was not just another barbarian raid that could be bought off with tribute. This was the beginning of a new age, one in which the nomads of the steppes had learned to crack open the greatest cities of the settled world. The fall of the city was accompanied by scenes of destruction that would be remembered for centuries. The Mongols, following their usual practice, gave the population a choice: submit completely or face annihilation. Those who chose submission were spared, but those who continued to resist were killed without mercy. The wealth that poured out of northern China transformed the Mongol Empire. Suddenly, Genghis Khan had access to resources on a scale that no steppe confederation had ever possessed. Chinese gold and silver filled Mongol treasuries. Chinese silk and porcelain became symbols of status among the Mongol elite. Chinese craftsmen were relocated to Mongolia to produce weapons and luxury goods for their new masters. But perhaps most importantly, he had Chinese administrators who understood taxation and record-keeping. Chinese craftsmen who could produce weapons and armor. Chinese scholars who could read and write in multiple languages. The Mongols were not just conquering territory. They were absorbing the accumulated knowledge and skills of one of the world's most advanced civilizations. The transformation was not one-sided. As the Mongols absorbed Chinese knowledge and techniques, they also began to influence Chinese culture and society. Chinese military technology was adapted for nomadic warfare. Chinese administrative systems were modified to govern a mobile population. Chinese art and literature began to reflect the new reality of nomadic rule. But perhaps most importantly, he had proof that his vision was not just a dream. The world could be conquered. The scattered peoples of the earth could be brought under one rule. The eternal blue sky had chosen the Mongols to be its instrument, and nothing, not walls, not armies, not the accumulated wisdom of ancient civilizations, could stand in their way. The conquest of northern China was more than a military victory. It was a validation of the Mongol worldview. It proved that their way of life, their values, their understanding of power and authority were not just suitable for the steppes, but could triumph over the most sophisticated civilizations on earth. The dragon of China had awakened the wolf of the steppes. Now it was time to see how far that wolf could run. While the conquest of northern China was still underway, events far to the west were setting the stage for an even more dramatic expansion of Mongol power. The Khwarezmid Empire, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, was one of the great powers of the Islamic world. Its Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, ruled over cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of learning and trade that had flourished for centuries along the Silk Road. The Khwarezmid Empire was a relatively recent creation, established in the late 12th century by Anushtagin Ghazi, a Turkish slave who had risen to become governor of Khwarezm under the Seljuk Sultans. His descendants had gradually expanded their territory, taking advantage of the fragmentation of the Islamic world following the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate and the collapse of Seljuk power. By the early 13th century, the Khwarezmid Empire had become one of the dominant powers in Central Asia and the Middle East. It controlled the vital trade routes between Europe and Asia, commanded vast agricultural resources in the river valleys of Central Asia, and had access to the wealth and learning of the Islamic world. The empire's military was formidable, based on Turkish and Persian traditions of cavalry warfare supplemented by Arab and Kurdish infantry. The Khwarezmid army included heavily armored cataphracts, mobile horse archers, and skilled siege engineers. Their cities were protected by massive fortifications that had withstood numerous attacks over the centuries. But the empire also had significant weaknesses. It was ethnically and religiously diverse, with Turkish rulers governing Persian, Arab, and Kurdish populations. The loyalty of local governors and military commanders was often questionable, and the empire lacked the administrative unity that characterized more established states. Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad was an ambitious ruler who dreamed of restoring the glory of the early Islamic conquests. He had expanded his territory through a series of successful campaigns and had begun to style himself as a new Saladin, a champion of Islam against the Christian crusaders and other enemies of the faith. But he had also made enemies through his aggressive policies and his tendency to interfere in the affairs of neighboring states. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad viewed him as a usurper and a threat to legitimate Islamic authority. The Ayyubid rulers of Syria and Egypt saw him as a rival for leadership of the Islamic world. Even within his own empire, there were those who questioned his legitimacy and his policies. The collision between the Mongols and the Khwarezmids began not with armies, but with merchants. Genghis Khan, ever practical, had sent a trade caravan to establish commercial relations with the Western Empire. He understood that conquest was only one path to wealth and power. Trade could be equally valuable and far less costly in blood. The caravan that set out from Mongolia in 1218 was impressive by any standard. It included 450 merchants, mostly Muslims from Central Asia, who had experience in long-distance trade. They carried with them gold, silver, silk, furs, and other valuable goods, as well as a letter from Genghis Khan expressing his desire for peaceful relations and profitable trade. The letter itself was a masterpiece of diplomacy, carefully crafted to appeal to the Shah's pride while making clear the benefits of cooperation with the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan addressed the Shah as an equal, praised his wisdom and power, and suggested that their two empires could benefit from closer relations. But when the Mongol caravan reached the border city of Otrar, the local governor, Inalchuk, suspicious of these strange foreigners from the east, accused them of being spies and had them executed. Their goods were confiscated, their heads sent to the Shah as trophies. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for the Islamic world. The governor's suspicions were not entirely unreasonable. The Mongols did use merchants as intelligence gatherers, and the caravan probably included men whose primary purpose was to assess the military and economic strength of the Khwarezmid Empire. But the execution of the merchants was a violation of the most basic principles of international law and diplomatic custom. More importantly, it was a catastrophic miscalculation of Mongol power and intentions. Inalchuk and his master, the Shah, assumed that the Mongols were just another nomadic confederation, dangerous perhaps in their own region, but incapable of projecting power across the vast distances that separated Mongolia from Central Asia. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding the governor's extradition and compensation for the murdered merchants. The diplomatic mission was led by a Muslim envoy who could speak to the Shah in his own language and cultural context, accompanied by two Mongol nobles who represented the Great Khan's authority. The Shah's response was to kill one of the ambassadors and send the others back with their beards shaved off, a mortal insult in the diplomatic language of the time. The Muslim envoy was beheaded, while the two Mongol nobles were humiliated and sent back to their master as living symbols of contempt. This response revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that would doom the Khwarezmid Empire. The Shah saw the Mongol embassy as a sign of weakness, an indication that these distant nomads were seeking his favor and could be treated with contempt. He failed to understand that he was dealing with a power that had already conquered northern China and was capable of projecting military force across continents. The Great Khan's reaction was swift and terrible. If the Khwarezmids wanted war, they would have war on a scale they could not imagine. The insult to his ambassadors was not just a personal affront, but a violation of the sacred principles that governed relations between civilized states. It could not be forgiven or forgotten. In 1219, Genghis Khan assembled an army of perhaps 200,000 men, the largest force he had ever commanded, and began the march west. The army included not just Mongol warriors, but Chinese engineers, Muslim administrators, and specialists from across the growing empire. It was a truly international force, united by loyalty to the Great Khan and commitment to his vision of world conquest. The march across Central Asia was itself an epic undertaking. The army had to cross deserts and mountain ranges, navigate political complexities, and maintain supply lines across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. But the Mongols had learned from their Chinese campaigns how to organize and sustain large-scale military operations, and their logistical capabilities were far superior to anything their enemies possessed. What followed was not just a military campaign, but an apocalypse. The Mongol war machine, perfected in the conquest of China, fell upon Central Asia like a plague of locusts. City after city fell with shocking speed. The systematic destruction that followed would be remembered for centuries as one of the great catastrophes of human history. Otrar, where the crisis had begun, was besieged and taken after a 5-month siege. The city's defenses were formidable, but the Mongols had learned from their Chinese campaigns how to conduct systematic siege warfare. They built their own fortifications around the city, constructed siege engines, and gradually wore down the defenders through constant pressure. When the city finally fell, the revenge was terrible and precise. Inalchuk, the governor who had started the war by executing the Mongol merchants, was captured alive and executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment that symbolically connected his fate to the silver he had stolen from the murdered merchants. But it was the fate of Samarkand and Bukhara that truly announced the arrival of a new age. These were not just cities, but symbols of Islamic civilization, centers of learning where scholars had preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of the ancient world. When they fell to the Mongols, it was as if the very foundations of the world were shaking. Bukhara was one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of learning and culture that had flourished for centuries. Its libraries contained thousands of manuscripts, its schools attracted students from across the known world, and its markets were filled with goods from Europe, Asia, and Africa. The siege of Bukhara became legendary for its psychological warfare. When the city's outer defenses were breached, Genghis Khan himself rode into the great mosque and declared to the assembled population that he was the punishment of God, sent to chastise them for their sins. Whether he truly believed this or was simply using religious language to break his enemy's will, the effect was devastating. The city surrendered without further resistance. The speech in the mosque was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Genghis Khan spoke in terms that his audience could understand, using Islamic concepts and language to justify his conquest. He presented himself not as a foreign invader, but as an instrument of divine justice, sent to punish the corruption and decadence that had weakened the Islamic world. The destruction that followed was systematic and complete. The libraries were burned, their precious manuscripts used as fuel for cooking fires. The schools were closed, their scholars killed or enslaved. The markets were looted, their goods distributed among the Mongol warriors. Within days, one of the great centers of Islamic civilization had been reduced to ruins. Samarkand, despite its massive fortifications and large garrison, lasted only 5 days. The speed of its fall sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. If Samarkand could not stand against the Mongols, what city could? The psychological impact was as devastating as the military one. The myth of Islamic invincibility, built up over centuries of conquest and expansion, was shattered in a matter of days. The siege of Samarkand demonstrated the full sophistication of Mongol military technology and tactics. The city was surrounded by a double wall and defended by a garrison of over 100,000 men. Its fortifications were among the strongest in the world, designed to withstand the most advanced siege techniques of the time. But the Mongols had learned from their Chinese campaigns how to conduct siege warfare on an unprecedented scale. They brought with them Chinese engineers who understood the principles of undermining walls and constructing siege engines. They had access to early forms of gunpowder weapons, including primitive cannons and explosive devices. More importantly, they understood how to coordinate different types of attacks to maximize their effectiveness. While their siege engines battered the walls, their cavalry cut off the city's supply lines. While their infantry assaulted the gates, their archers kept the defenders pinned down on the walls. It was a systematic approach to warfare that overwhelmed even the most sophisticated defenses. The psychological impact of these victories was as important as their military significance. The Mongols were not just conquering territory, they were shattering the confidence of entire civilizations. The message was clear. Resistance was futile, surrender was the only rational choice, and the old world of divided kingdoms and competing empires was coming to an end. But Genghis Khan was not content with conquest alone. He was building something new, a system of governance that could hold together the vast territories he was accumulating. He established the Yam, a postal relay system that allowed messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other with unprecedented speed. Riders could cover up to 200 miles in a single day, changing horses at relay stations that were spaced at regular intervals across the empire. The Yam was more than just a communication system. It was the nervous system of the empire, the means by which the great Khan could maintain control over territories that spanned continents. Orders issued in Mongolia could reach the farthest provinces within weeks. Intelligence gathered on distant frontiers could be transmitted to the center with remarkable speed. He promoted religious tolerance, understanding that a diverse empire needed diverse beliefs to coexist. Unlike many conquerors who tried to impose their own religious beliefs on their subjects, Genghis Khan actively encouraged religious diversity. He exempted religious leaders from taxation, protected places of worship, and even consulted with holy men from different traditions. This policy of religious tolerance was both pragmatic and principled. Pragmatically, it reduced the likelihood of religious rebellions and made it easier to govern diverse populations. Principled, it reflected the Mongol belief that all genuine religious traditions were different paths to the same ultimate truth. He standardized weights and measures, created a common legal code, and began the process of turning a collection of conquered territories into a functioning state. The Yasa, the great law code that governed the Mongol Empire, was based on traditional steppe customs, but adapted to the needs of a vast, diverse empire. The legal system that emerged was remarkably advanced for its time. It provided equal justice for all subjects regardless of their ethnic or religious background. It protected merchants and travelers, encouraged trade and communication, and established clear procedures for resolving disputes. In many ways, it was more progressive than the legal systems of more established civilizations. The whirlwind that had begun on the Mongolian steppes was now spinning across the known world, gathering strength with every revolution, drawing everything in its path into its inexorable dance of destruction and creation. But this was only the beginning. The conquest of the Khwarezmid Empire had demonstrated that no power on earth could stand against the Mongol war machine. Now it was time to see how far that machine could reach. The Mongol way of war was unlike anything their enemies had ever encountered. It was not the clash of armored knights or the disciplined advance of infantry legions. It was something more primal, more terrifying. It was the hunt, elevated to the level of high art, the ancient rhythms of the steppes transformed into a symphony of destruction that could bring down empires. Every Mongol warrior was first and foremost a hunter. From childhood, they learned to track prey across vast distances, to read the subtle signs of wind and weather, to coordinate with others in driving animals toward waiting archers, to kill cleanly and efficiently without wasting arrows or effort. When they went to war, they simply applied these same skills to human prey, with results that terrified and amazed their enemies. The Great Hunt, the Batu, was both military exercise and social ritual, a ceremony that bound the Mongol people together in shared purpose and common identity. Thousands of Mongols would spread out across hundreds of miles of steppe, forming a vast circle that gradually contracted over the course of days or weeks, driving all the game within it toward a central killing ground. The organization required for such an undertaking was staggering. Every participant had to know his exact position in the Great Circle, had to maintain that position as the formation moved across broken terrain, had to coordinate his movements with thousands of others without any modern means of communication. It required perfect discipline, absolute trust, and the ability to think and act as part of a larger organism. The hunt was also a test of character and skill. Young warriors proved their courage by facing down charging wild boar or wounded bears. Experienced hunters demonstrated their marksmanship by bringing down swift antelope or high-flying birds. Leaders showed their wisdom by coordinating the movements of the Great Circle and ensuring that the hunt proceeded according to plan. But perhaps most importantly, the hunt was a rehearsal for war. The same skills that allowed the Mongols to drive game toward a killing ground could be used to surround and destroy enemy armies. The same discipline that kept the hunting circle intact could maintain military formations under the stress of battle. The same coordination that made the hunt successful could execute complex tactical maneuvers against human opponents. When the Mongols adapted this technique to warfare, the results were devastating. Enemy armies found themselves surrounded by forces that seemed to appear from nowhere, harried by arrows shot from horseback at full gallop, unable to close with an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the traditional manner. The Mongol composite bow was the perfect weapon for this style of warfare. Made from horn, sinew, and wood, it combined the best properties of each material to create a weapon of extraordinary power and accuracy. The horn provided compression strength, the sinew provided tension, and the wood provided flexibility. The result was a bow that could drive an arrow through armor at distances that European crossbows could not match. The construction of a composite bow was a complex process that could take months or even years to complete. The materials had to be carefully selected and prepared, then laminated together using special glues made from fish bladders or animal tendons. The bow had to be shaped and seasoned, tested and adjusted, until it achieved the perfect balance of power and accuracy. A skilled Mongol archer could loose 12 arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to reload once, and he could do it while riding at full speed across broken ground. The arrows themselves were carefully crafted for different purposes, some designed to penetrate armor, others to cause maximum damage to unprotected targets, still others to create psychological effects through their distinctive whistling sound. But the real genius of Mongol tactics lay not in any single weapon or technique, but in their systematic approach to intelligence gathering and psychological warfare. Before any major campaign, Mongol spies would spend months or even years infiltrating enemy territory, mapping roads and fortifications, identifying potential allies and sources of supply, spreading rumors and disinformation. The Mongol intelligence network was perhaps the most sophisticated in the medieval world. It included merchants who traveled the trade routes, diplomats who visited foreign courts, refugees who fled from conquered territories, and local inhabitants who were recruited or coerced into providing information. This network allowed the Mongols to know their enemies better than their enemies knew themselves. The information gathered by this network was used to plan campaigns with extraordinary precision. The Mongols knew which cities were strongly defended and which were vulnerable, which routes offered the best opportunities for surprise attacks, which local leaders might be willing to switch sides, which populations were likely to resist, and which might welcome liberation from their current rulers. When the attack finally came, it was not a single blow, but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to maximize terror and minimize Mongol casualties. The initial strikes were often directed not at military targets but at the economic and psychological foundations of enemy resistance. Trade routes were cut, agricultural areas were devastated, and civilian populations were terrorized into submission. Cities that surrendered immediately were treated with relative mercy. Their populations were spared, their leaders were often allowed to remain in power, and their economic activities were allowed to continue under Mongol supervision. But those that resisted faced escalating levels of destruction, culminating in the complete annihilation that became the Mongol signature. The siege of Kiev in 1240 provides a perfect example of this systematic approach. The city was one of the great centers of medieval Europe, the mother of Russian cities, protected by massive walls and defended by thousands of warriors. Its fall would send shockwaves throughout the Christian world and demonstrate that no city, no matter how strong or well defended, was safe from Mongol power. Kiev was not just a city but a symbol of Orthodox Christianity and Slavic civilization. It had been the capital of the Kievan Rus, the first great Russian state, and it remained the spiritual and cultural center of the Orthodox world. Its churches contained priceless religious artifacts, its libraries preserved ancient manuscripts, and its schools trained the priests and scholars who served throughout Eastern Europe. The city's defenses were formidable. Its walls were 30 feet high and reinforced with towers and gates that had withstood numerous attacks over the centuries. Its garrison included not just local militia, but professional soldiers from across the Russian principalities. Its location on the Dnieper River provided natural protection and access to supply lines that stretched across Eastern Europe. When the Mongol general Batu Khan arrived with his army, he first sent envoys offering terms of surrender. The message was simple: submit now and be spared, resist and face annihilation. It was the same offer that had been made to dozens of other cities, and those that had accepted it had generally been treated well. But Kiev, confident in its defenses and its spiritual protection, chose to resist. The siege that followed demonstrated the full sophistication of Mongol military engineering. The Mongols had learned from their Chinese campaigns how to build and deploy siege engines on a scale that dwarfed anything their enemies possessed. They constructed catapults that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, battering rams that could smash through the strongest gates, and towers that allowed their archers to shoot down onto the defenders from above. But they also employed tactics that were uniquely their own. Instead of simply battering down walls, they used catapults to hurl not just stones but psychological weapons, the heads of captured defenders, diseased corpses, even live prisoners who could scream warnings to their comrades inside the city. The goal was not just to breach the physical defenses, but to break the will of the defenders. The siege lasted for several weeks, during which the Mongols gradually tightened their grip on the city. They built their own fortifications to prevent sorties, dug tunnels to undermine the walls, and maintained constant pressure on the defenders through arrow fire and psychological warfare. Inside the city, conditions gradually deteriorated. Food became scarce as the siege dragged on. Disease spread through the crowded streets. Morale collapsed as it became clear that no relief force was coming, that the other Russian principalities were either unable or unwilling to come to Kiev's aid. When Kiev finally fell, the destruction was so complete that a European traveler passing through 6 years later reported seeing nothing but skulls and bones scattered across the ruins. The great churches were stripped of their treasures and then destroyed. The libraries were burned, their precious manuscripts used as fuel for cooking fires. The population was killed or enslaved, and the city itself was so thoroughly demolished that grass grew where streets had been. It was a message written in blood and ash. This is what happens to those who defy the will of the great Khan. But it was also something more, a demonstration of the Mongol ability to project power across vast distances, to coordinate complex military operations, and to achieve total victory against even the most formidable opponents. But the Mongols were not mindless destroyers. They were selective in their brutality, surgical in their application of terror. Craftsmen and scholars were spared and relocated to other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. Religious leaders who preached submission were protected and honored. Merchants who could facilitate trade were encouraged to continue their activities under Mongol protection. The message was clear. The Mongols were not enemies of civilization itself, only of those who refused to accept their vision of universal empire. Those who submitted willingly could expect to prosper under Mongol rule. Those who resisted would face annihilation so complete that their very names would be forgotten. This combination of tactical brilliance and strategic ruthlessness made the Mongol military machine virtually unstoppable. They could adapt to any enemy, any terrain, any situation. They learned from every victory and every defeat, constantly refining their methods, constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible in medieval warfare. The great hunt had become a great conquest, and there seemed to be no limit to how far it could extend. From the steppes of Mongolia to the forests of Russia, from the deserts of Central Asia to the plains of Eastern Europe, the Mongol war machine rolled forward like an unstoppable force of nature, reshaping the world in its wake. In 1227, as his armies were completing the destruction of the Western Xia kingdom that had been his first target outside Mongolia, Genghis Khan fell ill during the campaign. The man who had seemed as eternal as the blue sky above the steppes was mortal after all, and the greatest conqueror in human history was about to face the one enemy that no amount of courage or cunning could defeat. The exact cause of his death remains a mystery wrapped in legend and deliberate obscurity. Some say he fell from his horse during a hunt, the victim of an accident that could have befallen any nomad warrior. Others claim he was wounded in battle against the Western Xia, struck down by an arrow or a sword thrust that proved more serious than initially thought. Still others whisper of poison, of a captured princess who chose death over dishonor and took the great Khan with her into the darkness. Perhaps the truth is simpler and more prosaic, that a man in his 60s, who had spent his entire adult life in the saddle, campaigning across continents, finally succumbed to the accumulated toll of a lifetime of warfare. The steppes were harsh, and even the strongest men eventually wore down under their relentless pressure. But if the manner of his death was uncertain, his preparations for it were meticulous and far-sighted. Genghis Khan had spent years thinking about succession, about how to preserve the unity he had forged among the Mongol tribes. about how to ensure that his empire would outlive him and continue to grow long after his bones had returned to the earth of his beloved steppes. The problem of succession was not a simple one. Traditional Mongol custom favored the youngest son, who was expected to remain with his parents and inherit the family's original territory. But Genghis Khan understood that the empire he had created was too vast and complex to be governed by traditional methods. It needed a ruler who combined military skill with administrative ability, who could command the loyalty of diverse peoples and manage the complex relationships between the various parts of the empire. His solution was characteristically practical and ruthless. He divided the empire among his 4 sons, but he made it clear that one of them, Ogadai, would be the great Khan, the supreme ruler to whom the others would owe allegiance. It was not the traditional Mongol way, which favored the eldest son, but Genghis Khan had never been bound by tradition when it conflicted with effectiveness. Yoki, the eldest son, received the western territories, including the lands that would later become the Golden Horde. But his legitimacy was questioned by some, who whispered that he might not be Genghis Khan's biological son, but the child of a Merkid captor. Whether these rumors were true or not, they created tensions that would eventually contribute to the fragmentation of the empire. Chagatai, the second son, received Central Asia, including the ancient cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. He was known for his strict adherence to Mongol law and tradition, and his descendants would maintain nomadic customs longer than the other branches of the family. Tolui, the youngest son, received the traditional inheritance of the Mongol homeland, along with the largest share of the army. According to custom, he was expected to serve as regent until the new great Khan was formally chosen and installed, but it was Ogadai who was designated as the next great Khan, the supreme ruler of the entire empire. He was not the most brilliant of his sons, nor the most charismatic, but he had qualities that his father valued even more highly: patience, diplomatic skill, and the ability to work with others rather than dominating them. He would need all of these qualities to hold together an empire that now stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea. The funeral of Genghis Khan was conducted according to ancient Mongol custom, in secret, with no permanent marker to show where the great conqueror lay. His body was taken to a sacred mountain in Mongolia, buried in an unmarked grave, and all traces of the burial site were obliterated. The funeral procession killed anyone they encountered along the way, ensuring that no one could reveal the location of the tomb. Even the soldiers who dug the grave were killed to preserve the secret, and horses were driven over the burial site to erase any signs of disturbance. Trees were planted to disguise the location, and the entire area was declared sacred, forbidden to all but the most trusted members of the royal family. It was a fitting end for a man who had always understood that power lay not in monuments or titles, but in the loyalty of followers and the fear of enemies. Genghis Khan had no need of a pyramid or a mausoleum. His tomb was the empire itself, stretching across a quarter of the inhabited world, a living monument to his vision of universal rule. The secrecy surrounding his burial was not just about preserving the location of his remains, it was about preserving the myth of his power. As long as no one knew where he was buried, he could not be desecrated by his enemies or turned into a mere relic by his followers. He remained what he had always been, a force of nature, a principle of conquest, an idea that could inspire or terrify long after the man himself had passed into legend. But death, even the death of the great Khan, could not stop the momentum he had created. The Mongol war machine he had built was too powerful, too perfectly adapted to conquest, to simply halt because its creator was gone. If anything, his death seemed to release new energies, new ambitions that had been held in check by his commanding presence. The empire he left behind was not just a collection of conquered territories, but a functioning system of government that could operate without his direct supervision. The decimal organization of the army, The postal relay system, the legal code, the administrative structures, all of these continued to function under their own momentum, guided by the principles he had established and the men he had trained. Ogedei Khan, when he was finally confirmed as Great Khan in 1229 after 2 years of political maneuvering, proved to be everything his father had hoped. He was a builder where Genghis had been a destroyer, a diplomat where his father had been a warrior, a man who understood that conquest was only the beginning of empire. Under his rule, the Mongol expansion would reach its greatest extent, pushing into Europe and completing the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China. The storm that Genghis Khan had unleashed was far from spent. In many ways, it was just reaching its full fury, driven by the vision of the man who had died, but whose spirit continued to guide his people toward their destiny as rulers of the world. The Great Khan was dead, but the Great Khan lived on in every Mongol warrior who rode to battle, in every administrator who governed conquered territories, in every merchant who traveled the trade routes that connected East and West. He had become more than a man. He had become an idea, a principle, a force that would continue to shape the world long after his bones had crumbled to dust in their secret grave beneath the eternal blue sky of Mongolia. Ogedei Khan inherited more than an empire from his father. He inherited a vision and a momentum that seemed to have a life of its own. The Mongol war machine that Genghis Khan had created was like a great wheel set in motion, and it would take more than the death of its creator to slow it down. The question was not whether the conquests would continue, but how far they would extend and in what directions they would flow. The new Great Khan understood this better than anyone. He had grown up watching his father transform a collection of feuding tribes into the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. He had learned the lessons of leadership not from books, but from the saddle, not from theory, but from the harsh realities of steppe politics and continental warfare. But Ogedei was not simply a pale copy of his father. Where Genghis Khan had been a force of nature, destructive and creative in equal measure, Ogedei was something more subtle, an architect of empire, a man who understood that conquest without consolidation was merely elaborate raiding, that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to build and maintain. His first great decision was to complete the work his father had begun in China. The Jin dynasty, weakened by decades of Mongol attacks, was finally destroyed in 1234. The fall of Kaifeng, the Jin capital, marked the end of a dynasty that had ruled northern China for more than a century. But more than that, it demonstrated that the Mongols had learned to be more than just raiders. They had become the inheritors of Chinese civilization, capable of governing as well as conquering. The siege of Kaifeng was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering, demonstrating how far Mongol siegecraft had evolved since the early campaigns. The city was one of the largest in the world, with a population of over 1 million people protected by massive walls and defended by the most advanced military technology of the time. The Mongols approached the siege with systematic patience, surrounding the city with their own fortifications and gradually tightening their grip. They employed Chinese engineers who had defected to their cause, men who understood the principles of undermining walls and constructing siege engines. They used early forms of gunpowder weapons, including primitive cannons and explosive devices that could breach even the strongest fortifications. But perhaps most importantly, they understood that the real strength of a city lay not in its walls but in its economic foundations. They systematically destroyed the agricultural infrastructure that supported Kaifeng, cutting off trade routes and supply lines, making the great city into a prison for its own inhabitants. The siege lasted for over a year, during which the Mongols demonstrated their ability to maintain complex military operations over extended periods. They built their own supply networks, established administrative systems to govern the surrounding territory, and coordinated their efforts with other Mongol armies operating in different parts of China. When Kaifeng finally fell, the wealth that flowed from this final victory was staggering. Chinese gold, silk, and craftsmanship poured into the Mongol treasury. Chinese administrators and engineers entered Mongol service, bringing with them knowledge of taxation, urban planning, and hydraulic engineering that would transform the Nomadic Empire into something unprecedented in world history. The integration of Chinese knowledge and personnel into the Mongol system was not just a matter of practical necessity. It was a conscious policy designed to create a new kind of empire that could combine the military advantages of nomadic organization with the administrative sophistication of settled civilization. Chinese scholars were employed to create written records and legal codes. Chinese engineers were used to design and build new cities and fortifications. Chinese merchants were encouraged to expand trade networks that connected the Mongol Empire to markets throughout Asia and beyond. But Ogedei's greatest achievement was not in the east, but in the west, where he authorized an expansion that would bring Mongol armies to the very heart of Europe. The campaign was entrusted to his nephew Batu Khan and the brilliant general Subutai, one of Genghis Khan's most trusted commanders and perhaps the greatest military strategist of the medieval period. Subutai was a man of humble origins who had risen through the ranks based purely on his tactical genius and unwavering loyalty to the great Khan. He had participated in virtually every major Mongol campaign, from the conquest of the Western Xia to the destruction of the Khwarezmid Empire. He understood Mongol military doctrine better than anyone except Genghis Khan himself, and he had the rare ability to adapt those principles to new enemies and unfamiliar terrain. The target was not just any kingdom, but the collection of Russian principalities that controlled the vast forests and river systems between the Mongol heartland and the wealthy cities of Western Europe. It was a logical next step in the Mongol expansion, but it was also something more, a test of whether the Mongol way of war could succeed in terrain completely different from the steppes where it had been perfected. The Russian principalities were unlike any enemy the Mongols had previously faced. They were not nomadic confederations that could be defeated through superior mobility, nor were they settled agricultural states that could be conquered through systematic siege warfare. They were something in between. Semi-feudal societies based on fortified cities connected by river trade routes and defended by heavily armored cavalry. The Russian military system was based on Byzantine models, with some adaptations for local conditions. The core of their armies consisted of heavily armored cavalry called druzhina, supported by infantry formations armed with axes, spears, and crossbows. They had developed sophisticated siege techniques and had access to Greek fire and other advanced military technologies. But their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, their reliance on fortified cities and river strongholds. The Russian princes had grown accustomed to fighting defensive campaigns, using their fortifications to channel and defeat enemy attacks. This approach had worked well against traditional nomadic raids, which typically lacked the patience and resources for extended sieges. The Mongols, however, were not traditional nomads. They had learned from their campaigns in China and Central Asia how to conduct systematic siege warfare, how to coordinate operations across vast distances, and how to maintain supply lines in hostile territory. More importantly, they had learned that the real strength of settled civilizations lay not in their fortifications, but in their economic systems, the complex networks of trade and agriculture that supported urban life. The Russian princes, like so many of the Mongols' enemies, fatally underestimated what they were facing. They saw the approaching army as just another nomadic raid, larger perhaps than usual, but fundamentally no different from the Pecheneg or Cuman incursions they had been dealing with for generations. They prepared to fight a traditional campaign of siege and counter-siege, of heavy cavalry charges and fortified positions. They could not have been more wrong. The Mongol invasion of Russia would demonstrate once again that the old ways of warfare were obsolete, that a new age had dawned in which mobility, intelligence, and systematic organization could triumph over any enemy, no matter how well armed or well defended. The storm that had begun on the Mongolian steppes was about to engulf Eastern Europe, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Mongol invasion of the Russian principalities began in 1237 with an attack on the city of Ryazan, a relatively minor target on the periphery of the Russian world. But the Mongols understood that in warfare, as in hunting, the first kill sets the tone for everything that follows. The destruction of Ryazan would serve as both a practical demonstration of Mongol capabilities and a psychological weapon designed to break the will of future opponents. Ryazan was a typical Russian city of the period, a wooden fortress surrounded by earthen ramparts, defended by a garrison of professional warriors and citizen militia. Its prince, Yuri Igorovich, was a minor member of the Rurikid dynasty that ruled most of the Russian principalities. He had received warnings about the approaching Mongol army, but like most of his contemporaries, he underestimated the threat they represented. The siege of Ryazan lasted only 5 days, a shockingly brief period for a fortified city that should have been able to hold out for months. The speed of its fall was due partly to Mongol military superiority, but also to the systematic way they applied pressure to every aspect of the city's defenses. The Mongols began by surrounding the city with their own fortifications, cutting off all escape routes and supply lines. They then deployed siege engines that had been constructed by Chinese engineers, including catapults that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds and battering rams that could smash through the strongest gates. But the real key to their success was psychological warfare. They made sure that the defenders could see the smoke from burning villages in the surrounding countryside, could hear the reports of refugees fleeing the devastation. They wanted the people of Ryazan to understand that their world was ending, that the old certainties were crumbling, that their only choice was between surrender and annihilation. When Ryazan finally fell, the destruction was so complete that, according to the chronicles, no eye remained open to weep for the dead. The city was burned to the ground, its population killed or enslaved, its treasures distributed among the Mongol warriors. It was a message written in blood and fire, a demonstration of what awaited any city that chose resistance over submission. But the destruction of Ryazan was not just an act of brutality. It was a calculated strategy designed to minimize Mongol casualties in future engagements. The terror inspired by the fate of Ryazan would make other cities more likely to surrender without a fight, saving both sides the costs of prolonged sieges. The news of Ryazan's fall spread throughout the Russian principalities like wildfire, carried by refugees and merchants who had witnessed the destruction. The reports were almost too terrible to believe. An entire city wiped from the face of the earth in less than a week, its people slaughtered without mercy, its buildings reduced to ash and rubble. But the real genius of the Mongol campaign lay not in any single battle, but in the systematic way they dismantled the entire structure of Russian resistance. Instead of attacking the strongest cities first, they began with the weakest, building momentum and spreading terror while learning the terrain and the enemy's capabilities. This approach had several advantages. It allowed the Mongols to perfect their siege techniques against relatively weak opponents before facing more formidable challenges. It created a psychological climate of fear and despair that weakened the will to resist. And it provided opportunities to recruit local guides and administrators who could help them navigate the complex political and geographical landscape of the Russian principalities. The Russian princes, bound by feudal obligations and personal rivalries, could not coordinate an effective response. Each principality fought alone, hoping that the storm would pass them by, that the Mongols would exhaust themselves against someone else's walls. It was exactly the kind of divided resistance that Mongol strategy was designed to exploit. The political fragmentation of the Russian principalities was both a cause and a consequence of their military weakness. The Rurikid dynasty that nominally ruled most of the Russian lands had long since fragmented into competing branches, each controlling its own territory and pursuing its own interests. The system of succession was based on seniority rather than primogeniture, which meant that power constantly shifted between different family members and created endless opportunities for conflict. This political instability was compounded by economic competition between the different principalities. Each city-state sought to control the most profitable trade routes, to attract the most skilled craftsmen, to accumulate the greatest wealth. Cooperation was rare and usually temporary, limited to specific threats or opportunities. The Mongols understood this weakness and exploited it ruthlessly. They made separate deals with different princes, offering favorable terms to those who submitted early while threatening terrible punishment for those who resisted. They played on existing rivalries and suspicions, encouraging some principalities to remain neutral while others were being destroyed. Moscow fell in 1238, though it was then just a minor trading post, not the great city it would later become. The siege was brief and the resistance minimal. The Muscovite princes had learned from the fate of Ryazan and chose submission over destruction. Their pragmatic decision would eventually pay dividends, as Moscow would become the center of Russian recovery and expansion in later centuries. Vladimir, the capital of the most powerful Russian principality, was taken after a brief siege in February of 1238. The city's fall was particularly shocking because it had been considered virtually impregnable, protected by massive walls and defended by the largest army in the Russian lands. The siege of Vladimir demonstrated the full sophistication of Mongol military engineering. The city was surrounded by a double wall and defended by thousands of warriors, but the Mongols had learned from their Chinese campaigns how to overcome such obstacles through systematic application of superior technology and tactics. They constructed siege engines that could breach the strongest fortifications, deployed Chinese engineers who understood the principles of undermining walls, and coordinated different types of attacks to maximize their effectiveness. The siege lasted only 4 days, after which the city was stormed and its population massacred. One by one, the cities of the Russian forest fell like dominoes, each collapse making the next one more inevitable. Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, Tver, ancient centers of Russian civilization were reduced to smoking ruins in a matter of weeks. The speed and thoroughness of the destruction was unprecedented in Russian history. The psychological impact was as devastating as the military one. These were not just defeats, but apocalyptic events that seemed to herald the end of the world itself. Russian chronicles describe the Mongol armies in terms borrowed from biblical prophecy, as harbingers of the Last Judgment, as punishment sent by God for the sins of the people. The Chronicle of Novgorod, one of the few contemporary sources to survive the destruction, describes the Mongol invasion in terms that convey both the scale of the catastrophe and the helplessness of its victims. In the winter of that year, the godless Tatars came like a plague of locusts, devouring the land and leaving nothing but death and desolation in their wake. But the Mongols were not content with conquest alone. They were students of warfare, constantly learning, constantly adapting their methods to new challenges. The Russian campaign taught them how to fight in forested terrain, how to conduct winter warfare in conditions that would have defeated most armies, how to coordinate attacks across vast distances using rivers as highways and supply lines. The winter campaign was particularly impressive from a logistical standpoint. Most medieval armies avoided winter warfare because of the difficulties of supplying troops in harsh conditions. But the Mongols had grown up in the harsh climate of the steppes and were accustomed to operating in extreme cold. They used the frozen rivers as highways, allowing their cavalry to move rapidly across terrain that would have been impassable in summer. They lived off the land when possible and maintained supply lines that stretched back to Mongolia when necessary. They demonstrated that winter could be an ally rather than an enemy for armies that were properly prepared and equipped. The climax of the Russian campaign came with the siege of Kiev in 1240. This was not just another city, but the mother of all Russian cities, the spiritual and cultural heart of Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe. Its fall would send shockwaves throughout the Christian world and announce that the Mongol expansion had entered a new phase. Kiev was the oldest and most prestigious of the Russian cities, the place where Christianity had first taken root in the Slavic world. Its churches contained priceless religious artifacts, its monasteries preserved ancient manuscripts, and its schools trained the priests and scholars who served throughout Eastern Europe. The city's defenses were formidable, massive walls that had been strengthened over the centuries, a large garrison that included warriors from throughout the Russian principalities, and a strategic location on the Dnieper River that provided natural protection and access to supply lines. But none of these advantages could save Kiev from the systematic application of Mongol military power. The siege itself was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering, demonstrating how far Mongol capabilities had evolved since the early campaigns against the Western Xia. The Mongols surrounded the city with their own fortifications, constructed siege engines that dwarfed anything the Russians possessed, and gradually wore down the defenders through constant bombardment and psychological pressure. Contemporary accounts describe the sound of their catapults as being like continuous thunder, so loud that men could not hear each other speak even when shouting. The siege lasted for several weeks, during which the Mongols demonstrated their ability to maintain complex operations over extended periods. They coordinated attacks from multiple directions, used Chinese engineers to undermine the walls, and employed psychological warfare to break the will of the defenders. When Kiev finally fell, the destruction was methodical and complete. The great churches were stripped of their treasures and then demolished. The libraries were burned, their precious manuscripts used as fuel for cooking fires. The population was killed or enslaved, and the city itself was so thoroughly destroyed that a European traveler passing through the ruins 6 years later reported seeing nothing but bones and skulls scattered across what had once been one of the greatest cities of medieval Europe. The fall of Kiev marked the end of the Kievan Rus as a political entity and the beginning of a new era in Eastern European history. The Mongol conquest had not just defeated the Russian principalities, it had fundamentally transformed the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the region. But even as they destroyed, the Mongols were building. They established administrative systems to govern their new territories, appointed local officials to collect taxes and maintain order, began the process of integrating the Russian principalities into their growing empire. They were not just conquerors, but empire builders, creating institutions that would outlast any individual campaign or commander. The Russian campaign was complete, but it was only the beginning. Beyond the forests and rivers of the Rus lay the wealthy kingdoms of Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, and beyond them, the ultimate prize, the Holy Roman Empire itself, the heart of medieval Christendom. The Mongol war machine was rolling west, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. The storm that had begun on the steppes of Mongolia was about to engulf all of Europe, and the world would never be the same. The year 1241 marked a turning point in world history, though few people alive at the time could have understood its significance. In that year, Mongol armies crossed the Carpathian Mountains and entered the heart of medieval Europe, bringing with them a way of warfare that would shatter the military assumptions of an entire civilization and come closer than any force before or since to conquering the continent that would later dominate the world. The Mongol invasion of Europe was not a single campaign, but a coordinated series of operations designed to overwhelm the continent's defenses, through simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. While Batu Khan led the main force through Hungary, other Mongol armies struck at Poland and Bohemia, preventing any possibility of coordinated European resistance. The first target was Poland, a kingdom that had grown wealthy from trade and agriculture, but had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. The Polish military system was based on heavy cavalry and fortified positions, tactics that had proven effective against traditional European enemies, but were completely unsuited to dealing with the mobile warfare that the Mongols had perfected. The Polish king, Henry the Pious, gathered his forces and marched to meet the invaders, confident that his heavy cavalry and fortified positions would prove superior to what he assumed were just another band of nomadic raiders. He had received reports about the Mongol conquests in Russia, but like most Europeans, he dismissed these as exaggerated tales told by frightened refugees. The Battle of Legnica, fought on April 9, 1241, was a catastrophe for the Polish forces and a demonstration of the tactical superiority that had made the Mongols masters of Eurasia. The engagement began at dawn, with the Polish army drawn up in traditional formation, heavy cavalry in the center, infantry on the flanks, crossbowmen providing support from the rear. The Mongols employed their traditional tactics of feigned retreat and envelopment, drawing the Polish cavalry into a trap where they could be destroyed piecemeal by arrow fire and coordinated charges. The Polish knights, weighed down by heavy armor and riding horses that were not bred for speed, found themselves unable to close with an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the traditional manner. The battle was decided within hours. The Polish cavalry, lured into pursuit of apparently retreating Mongol forces, found themselves surrounded and cut to pieces by arrows shot from horseback at full gallop. King Henry himself was killed in the fighting, along with most of his nobles and professional soldiers. The Polish army was virtually annihilated, leaving the kingdom defenseless against further Mongol attacks. But the real shock came after the battle, when the Mongols displayed their grisly trophies. They had cut off the ears of the dead Polish soldiers and filled 9 large sacks with them, a practice that served both as a body count and as psychological warfare. The message was clear. This was not warfare as Europeans understood it, but something far more systematic and terrifying. The mutilation of the dead was not mere savagery, but a calculated psychological tactic designed to spread terror throughout Europe. The Mongols understood that fear could be more effective than actual violence, that the reputation for ruthlessness could make future enemies more likely to surrender without a fight. The news of the Polish defeat spread throughout Europe with unprecedented speed, carried by refugees, merchants, and church officials who had witnessed the destruction. The reports were almost too terrible to believe. An entire royal army destroyed in a single day, a king killed, a kingdom left defenseless against an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. While one Mongol army was destroying Polish resistance, another was moving through the Carpathian passes into Hungary. This was the main thrust of the European campaign, led by Batu Khan himself and supported by some of the most experienced generals in the Mongol army, including the legendary Subutai. Hungary was a more formidable target than Poland. King Bela IV commanded a large and well-equipped army, and the Hungarian plains, while different from the Mongolian steppes, were at least suitable for cavalry warfare. The Hungarians had also received warning of what was coming and had time to prepare their defenses. The Hungarian military system was more sophisticated than that of Poland, incorporating elements borrowed from Byzantine and Western European traditions. The core of their army consisted of heavily armored cavalry, but they also had light cavalry units that could engage in mobile warfare, infantry formations armed with crossbows and pikes, and siege engines that could be used for both offensive and defensive operations. King Bela IV was an experienced military commander who had fought successful campaigns against his neighbors and had studied the reports coming from Russia and Poland. He understood that he was facing an unprecedented threat and had taken steps to prepare his kingdom for invasion. The decisive battle came at Mohi, on the banks of the Sajo River, on April 11th, 1241. It was here that the Mongols demonstrated the full sophistication of their military system, employing tactics that combined traditional steppe warfare with innovations learned from their Chinese campaigns and adapted to European conditions. The Hungarian army had taken up a strong defensive position on the west bank of the river, protected by marshes and earthworks that channeled any attack into a narrow front. King Bela had positioned his forces to take advantage of the terrain, with his heavy cavalry ready to charge any enemy that attempted to cross the river. The battle began before dawn, with a Mongol force crossing the river under cover of darkness and establishing a bridgehead on the Hungarian side. The crossing was accomplished using portable bridges that the Mongols had learned to construct during their Chinese campaigns, allowing them to move large numbers of troops across water obstacles that their enemies assumed were impassable. When the Hungarian army moved to contain this threat, they found themselves caught between two forces as another Mongol army crossed the river at a different point, using a bridge they had secretly constructed during the night. The Hungarians suddenly found themselves fighting on two fronts, their carefully prepared defensive positions rendered useless by Mongol tactical flexibility. But the real genius of the Mongol plan lay not in the initial deployment, but in what happened next. Instead of simply surrounding and destroying the Hungarian army, the Mongols deliberately left one escape route open. As the Hungarians began to retreat through this gap, they found themselves strung out in a long column, perfect targets for the Mongol horse archers who had been waiting in ambush. The slaughter was immense. Contemporary accounts speak of the Hungarian dead covering the battlefield like fallen leaves, of rivers running red with blood, of an entire kingdom's military power destroyed in a single day. King Bela IV barely escaped with his life, fleeing to the Adriatic coast while his kingdom collapsed behind him. The Battle of Mohi was more than just a military victory. It was a demonstration of the tactical and strategic superiority that had made the Mongols masters of Eurasia. They had defeated the largest and best-equipped army in Central Europe, using methods that their enemies could barely comprehend, much less counter. The psychological impact of these victories reverberated throughout Europe like an earthquake. The Mongols were no longer a distant threat but an immediate reality, an unstoppable force that had shattered two kingdoms in the space of a few weeks. Panic spread through the courts of Western Europe as rulers tried to comprehend what they were facing. The reports reaching Western Europe were almost too terrible to believe. Entire kingdoms had been conquered in a matter of weeks. Armies that had seemed invincible had been destroyed in single battles. Cities that had stood for centuries had been reduced to smoking ruins. It was as if the apocalypse itself had been unleashed upon the world. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade against the Mongols, but his appeal fell on deaf ears. The European powers were too shocked, too divided, too unprepared to mount an effective response. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was locked in conflict with the Pope and could spare no troops for the defense of Christendom. The French King Louis IX was preparing for his own crusade to the Holy Land and saw the Mongol threat as someone else's problem. The fragmentation of European political authority, which had been a source of dynamism and competition during the High Middle Ages, now became a fatal weakness. No single ruler had the authority to coordinate a continental response to the Mongol threat. Each kingdom looked to its own defenses, hoping that the storm would pass them by. As 1241 drew to a close, Mongol armies were wintering in Hungary, consolidating their conquests and preparing for the next phase of their campaign. Scouts had already penetrated as far as Austria and Bohemia, gathering intelligence for what seemed certain to be an assault on the very heart of medieval Europe. The Mongol war machine had demonstrated its ability to adapt to European conditions, to overcome the military advantages that had made European armies dominant in their own region. The heavy cavalry that had been the backbone of European military power for centuries had proven helpless against Mongol mobility and tactical flexibility. And then suddenly, everything changed. In December of 1241, as Mongol armies prepared for what might have been the final conquest of medieval Europe, a messenger arrived at Batu Khan's camp in Hungary, carrying news that would alter the course of world history. In December of 1241, as Mongol armies prepared for what might have been the final conquest of medieval Europe, a messenger arrived at Batu Khan's camp in Hungary carrying news that would change the course of world history. The message was brief but earth-shattering. Ögedei Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, was dead. The news hit the Mongol commanders like a thunderbolt from the eternal blue sky. Everything they had been planning, all their preparations for the conquest of Western Europe, suddenly became secondary to a more immediate concern, the succession crisis that would inevitably follow the death of the great Khan. Ögedei's death was unexpected and came at the worst possible moment for Mongol expansion in Europe. He had been in good health and was actively planning future campaigns when he suddenly fell ill and died within a matter of days. Some sources suggest that he died from excessive drinking, a common problem among the Mongol elite who had access to the wines and spirits of conquered territories. Others hint at poison, though no definitive evidence has ever been found. According to Mongol law and tradition, all the princes of the blood had to return to Karakorum, the Mongol capital, to participate in the Kurultai that would choose the next great Khan. This was not a suggestion or a request. It was an absolute obligation that took precedence over any military campaign, no matter how promising or how close to completion. The law of succession was one of the fundamental principles that held the Mongol Empire together. It ensured that the transition of power would be orderly and legitimate, that all branches of the royal family would have a voice in choosing the new ruler, and that the empire would not fragment into competing factions during periods of political uncertainty. Batu Khan, despite being on the verge of what might have been the greatest conquest in Mongol history, had no choice but to begin the long journey back to Mongolia. The Mongol armies that had terrorized Europe for 2 years simply melted away, disappearing back across the steppes as suddenly as they had appeared. The withdrawal was conducted with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the invasion. The Mongols did not retreat in panic or disorder. They executed a planned withdrawal that left their enemies confused and uncertain about their intentions. Some European observers initially thought it was a tactical maneuver, a temporary withdrawal designed to lure European armies into a trap. It was one of the great turning points in world history, though its significance would only become clear in retrospect. Medieval Europe, which had seemed defenseless against the Mongol war machine, was granted a reprieve that would last for centuries. The kingdoms that had been preparing for annihilation were given time to recover, to learn from their defeats, to develop new military technologies and tactics that might have a chance against nomadic cavalry. The impact of the Mongol withdrawal was immediate and profound. European rulers who had been preparing for the end of the world suddenly found themselves with breathing room to rebuild their shattered armies and strengthen their defenses. The panic that had gripped the continent began to subside, replaced by a cautious optimism that perhaps the worst was over. But the Mongol withdrawal was not a retreat in any meaningful sense. It was a strategic pause, a temporary redirection of energies toward internal politics rather than external conquest. The empire that Genghis Khan had founded was too vast, too complex, to be governed by the simple tribal methods that had sufficed for a confederation of nomadic clans. The journey back to Mongolia was itself an epic undertaking. Batu Khan and his army had to cross thousands of miles of difficult terrain, navigate complex political situations, and maintain discipline and cohesion during a march that would take many months to complete. The Kurultai that assembled in Karakorum in 1246 was unlike any political gathering in human history. Representatives came from every corner of the known world, Mongol princes from the steppes, Chinese administrators from Beijing, Persian bureaucrats from Isfahan, Russian nobles from Kiev, even European envoys who had come to negotiate with the new Great Khan. It was a parliament of the conquered, an assembly that represented not just the Mongol tribes, but the entire Eurasian landmass. The delegates spoke dozens of different languages, practiced different religions, and represented different cultural traditions, but they were all united by their common allegiance to the Mongol Empire. The choice of the new Great Khan was not automatic. Ogadai had designated his son, Guyuk, as his successor, but Guyuk was young, inexperienced, and had enemies among the other branches of the royal family. The political maneuvering was intense, with different factions supporting different candidates, each with their own vision of what the empire should become. The succession crisis revealed the underlying tensions that existed within the Mongol Empire. The different branches of the royal family had developed their own interests and priorities, shaped by their experiences governing different parts of the empire. The descendants of Jochi, who ruled the western territories, had different concerns from those of Chagatai, who controlled Central Asia, or Tolui, who governed the Mongol heartland. In the end, Guyuk was chosen, but his reign would be brief and troubled. He died in 1248, possibly poisoned, after ruling for less than 2 years. His death triggered another succession crisis, another Kurultai, another pause in the Mongol expansion while the empire's leaders sorted out their internal affairs. The political instability that followed Ogadai's death was not just a temporary disruption. It was a sign of deeper structural problems within the empire. The Mongol system of government, which had been designed for a nomadic confederation, was struggling to adapt to the needs of a vast, sedentary empire that encompassed dozens of different peoples and cultures. It was not until 1251 that a new Great Khan was finally chosen. Mongke, a grandson of Genghis Khan, who combined military experience with administrative skill. Under his leadership, the Mongol Empire would enter its final phase of expansion, but the moment of maximum opportunity in Europe had passed. The pause that had begun with Ogadai's death had given medieval Europe time to breathe, time to adapt, time to develop the military innovations that would eventually make nomadic cavalry less dominant on the battlefield. The age of gunpowder was still centuries away, but the age of Mongol invincibility was beginning to wane. European military technology and tactics began to evolve in response to the Mongol threat. New types of fortifications were developed that could better withstand siege warfare. Crossbow technology was improved to provide infantry with weapons that could penetrate nomadic armor. Most importantly, European armies began to experiment with combined arms tactics that integrated cavalry, infantry, and missile weapons in ways that could counter Mongol mobility. Still, the empire that Mongke inherited was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It was a realm that dwarfed anything that had come before it, a political entity that encompassed dozens of different peoples, languages, and cultures under a single rule. The question now was not whether the Mongols could conquer more territory. They had already conquered more than any empire in history, but whether they could hold it together, whether they could transform their military success into lasting political institutions, whether they could create a system of government that could survive the death of individual rulers and the passage of time. The pause that had saved Europe had also given the Mongols time to reflect on their achievements and their challenges. They had conquered the world, but could they govern it? They had destroyed the old order, but could they create a new one? These were the questions that would define the next phase of Mongol history, and the answers would determine whether their empire would endure for centuries or collapse under the weight of its own success. Mongke Khan understood that the empire he had inherited was at a crossroads. The easy conquests were over. The remaining targets, the Song dynasty in southern China, The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the scattered kingdoms of Southeast Asia, would require different strategies, different approaches than the lightning campaigns that had brought the Mongols to power. More fundamentally, the empire was beginning to change from within. The Mongol elite, once content with felt tents and mare's milk, were developing a taste for the luxuries of settled civilization. Chinese silk, Persian carpets, Arab books. These were becoming not just trophies of conquest, but necessities of life for the Mongol aristocracy. This transformation was most visible in China, where the Mongols had established what would become the Yuan dynasty, and were gradually adopting Chinese methods of government. The process was not immediate or complete. It would take decades for the Mongols to fully adapt to Chinese administrative practices, but the direction of change was clear. Kublai Khan, Mongka's brother and the Mongol ruler of China, was becoming more Chinese than Mongol in his outlook, surrounding himself with Confucian scholars and Buddhist monks, building palaces in the Chinese style, even writing poetry in Chinese. He was not abandoning his Mongol identity, but he was adapting it to the requirements of governing a Chinese population. This cultural adaptation was both necessary and dangerous. It was necessary because the Mongols could not govern China effectively without understanding Chinese culture, language, and administrative practices. The Chinese bureaucratic system was the most sophisticated in the world, and the Mongols needed Chinese administrators to collect taxes, maintain records, and implement policies. But this cultural transformation came at a cost. The more Chinese the Mongol rulers became, the less connected they were to the steppes that had given birth to their empire. The warrior ethos that had made the Mongol conquests possible was being diluted by the administrative requirements of governing a settled population. The same process was occurring in other parts of the empire. In Persia, Mongol rulers were adopting Islamic customs and Persian administrative practices. In Russia, they were learning to work with Orthodox Christian institutions and Slavic political traditions. Each adaptation made the empire more effective at governing its diverse populations, but it also made it less distinctively Mongol. Mongke himself was caught between these competing pressures. He understood that the empire needed to evolve, to develop more sophisticated methods of government, but he also knew that the Mongol military advantage depended on maintaining their nomadic traditions, their mobility, their willingness to endure hardships that would break other armies. His solution was to launch one final series of conquests that would complete the Mongol domination of Eurasia while there was still time, while the empire still retained its military edge. He assigned Kublai Khan to complete the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, while he himself would lead an army against the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The campaign against Baghdad was more than just another conquest. It was a symbolic assault on one of the pillars of medieval civilization. The Abbasid Caliphate, though weakened by centuries of political fragmentation, was still the spiritual center of the Islamic world, the heir to the Prophet Muhammad's legacy, the guardian of Islamic law and learning. Baghdad itself was one of the great cities of the medieval world, a center of learning and culture that had flourished for over 500 years. Its libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its schools attracted students from across the Islamic world, and its markets were filled with goods from Europe, Asia, and Africa. The city's defenses were formidable. It was protected by a double wall and defended by a large garrison that included not just local troops, but soldiers from throughout the Islamic world who had come to defend the seat of the caliphate. The city's strategic location on the Tigris River provided natural protection and access to supply lines that stretched across the Middle East. But the Abbasid Caliphate was also weakened by internal divisions and external pressures. The caliph's authority was largely symbolic. Real power was held by various military commanders and regional governors who often pursued their own interests rather than those of the caliphate as a whole. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 was a masterpiece of Mongol military engineering and a demonstration of how far their capabilities had evolved since the early campaigns. The city was surrounded by a double wall and defended by a large garrison, but the Mongols had learned to overcome such obstacles through a combination of siege engines, psychological warfare, and systematic destruction of the surrounding countryside. The Mongols began by cutting off the city's supply lines and destroying the agricultural infrastructure that supported its population. They built their own fortifications around the city, constructed siege engines that could breach the strongest walls, and gradually wore down the defenders through constant bombardment and psychological pressure. The siege lasted for several weeks, during which the Mongols demonstrated their ability to maintain complex operations over extended periods. They coordinated attacks from multiple directions, used engineers from various parts of the empire to construct specialized equipment, and employed psychological warfare to break the will of the defenders. When Baghdad finally fell, the destruction was apocalyptic and systematic. The Great Library, which had preserved the learning of the ancient world for centuries, was thrown into the Tigris River. Contemporary accounts claim that the water ran black with ink for days as hundreds of thousands of manuscripts dissolved in the current. The destruction of the House of Wisdom was one of the great cultural catastrophes of human history. This institution had been the center of Islamic learning for centuries, the place where Greek philosophy had been preserved and transmitted, where mathematical and scientific advances had been made, where scholars from different traditions had come together to exchange ideas. The caliph himself was executed, wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, a method chosen to avoid spilling royal blood, which the Mongols considered unlucky. With his death, the Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed for over 500 years, came to an end. The fall of Baghdad sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. This was not just the conquest of another city, but the end of an institution that had existed for more than 500 years, the destruction of the spiritual and intellectual center of Islamic civilization. The psychological impact was enormous. Muslims throughout the world had looked to Baghdad as the center of their faith, the place where the caliph resided and from which Islamic law and doctrine were promulgated. Its destruction seemed to herald the end of the Islamic world itself. But even as Mongol was achieving this historic victory, the empire was beginning to show signs of strain. The vast distances involved in governing such a huge territory were creating communication problems that even the efficient Mongol postal system could not entirely solve. Local commanders were beginning to act independently, making decisions based on local conditions rather than imperial policy. More ominously, the different parts of the empire were beginning to develop their own identities, their own interests that did not always align with those of the great Khan in Karakoram. The Mongol Empire was becoming not one empire but several, held together more by tradition and family ties than by any real unity of purpose. The death of Mongke in 1259 during the campaign in China marked the beginning of the end of Mongol unity. The succession crisis that followed would split the empire into competing khanates, each pursuing its own agenda, each gradually losing the characteristics that had made the Mongol conquests possible. Mongke's death was sudden and unexpected, coming at a crucial moment in the Chinese campaign. Some sources suggest that he died of disease, others that he was killed in battle, still others that he was poisoned by rivals within the Mongol court. The truth may never be known, but the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The age of universal empire was coming to an end, but its legacy would endure for centuries. The Mongols had demonstrated that it was possible to govern vast, diverse populations under a single authority, that different cultures and religions could coexist within a common political framework, that trade and communication could flow freely across continental distances. These achievements would not be forgotten, even as the empire that had made them possible began to fragment and decline. The vision of universal empire that had driven Genghis Khan and his successors would continue to inspire conquerors and empire builders for centuries to come, from Timur to the Ottomans to the modern nation-states that still dream of global dominance. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 triggered the most serious succession crisis in Mongol history, a conflict that would permanently shatter the unity of the empire and mark the beginning of its transformation from a single political entity into a collection of competing regional powers. Unlike previous transitions, where the choice of a new great Khan had been difficult but ultimately successful, this time, the empire's unity itself was at stake. The vast distances that separated the different parts of the empire, the cultural adaptations that had occurred in each region, and the personal ambitions of the various Mongol princes all combined to create a crisis that could not be resolved through traditional means. The two main candidates were Mongol's brothers, Kublai Khan, who controlled China and had the support of the Chinese bureaucracy, and Arik Boka, who remained in Mongolia and claimed to represent traditional Mongol values. It was more than a personal rivalry. It was a fundamental disagreement about what the Mongol Empire should become and how it should be governed. Kublai Khan represented the future as he saw it, a settled empire that would adopt the best practices of Chinese civilization while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. He had surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, built a new capital at Beijing, and was in the process of completing the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. Kublai's vision was of an empire that could combine the administrative sophistication of Chinese civilization with the military prowess of the Mongol tradition. He believed that the Mongols could become the inheritors of Chinese culture while maintaining their identity as conquerors and rulers. His court in Beijing was a cosmopolitan center where Chinese scholars worked alongside Mongol administrators, where Confucian philosophy was studied alongside traditional Mongol customs, where the latest Chinese technologies were adapted for Mongol use. It was a synthesis of cultures that had never been attempted on such a scale. Arik Boka, by contrast, represented the past, the nomadic traditions that had made the Mongol conquests possible, the steppes culture that valued mobility over luxury, the warrior ethos that had carried Mongol armies from Mongolia to Hungary. He controlled the traditional Mongol heartland and had the support of many of the old guard who were suspicious of their brother's adoption of foreign ways. From Arik Boka's perspective, the empire was losing its soul. The Mongols who had once lived in felt tense and survived on mare's milk were now building palaces and surrounding themselves with foreign advisors. The warriors who had conquered the world through their mobility and toughness were becoming soft administrators who preferred silk robes to leather armor. He saw himself as the guardian of Mongol purity, the defender of the traditions that had made the empire possible in the first place. His supporters included many of the traditional Mongol nobles, the shamans who maintained the old religious practices, and the military commanders who had grown up under Genghis Khan and remembered the early days of conquest. The civil war that followed was devastating for Mongol unity and marked the beginning of the empire's fragmentation. For 4 years, from 1260 to 1264, the two brothers fought for control of the empire, each claiming to be the legitimate great Khan, each trying to rally support from the various Mongol princes and generals scattered across Eurasia. The conflict was not just military but ideological, pitting two different visions of what the Mongol Empire should become against each other. It was a struggle between tradition and innovation, between the nomadic past and the settled future, between the steppes and the cities. The war was fought across multiple fronts, from the grasslands of Mongolia to the cities of northern China. Both sides employed traditional Mongol tactics, but they also adapted to the new realities of governing settled populations. Chinese siege engines were used alongside Mongol cavalry, Chinese administrators helped organize supply lines, and Chinese gold helped finance the war effort. In the end, Kublai Khan's superior resources proved decisive. His control of China's wealth and population gave him advantages that Arik Boka, despite his legitimacy in traditional terms, could not match. The agricultural surplus of northern China could support larger armies for longer periods than the pastoral economy of Mongolia. Chinese craftsmen could produce weapons and equipment in quantities that nomadic smiths could never achieve. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The empire was permanently fractured. The Civil War had demonstrated that the Mongol Empire was too large and diverse to be governed as a single political entity. The different regions had developed their own interests and identities that could not be reconciled under a single authority. Even after Arik Boka's surrender in 1264, the other Mongol Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, refused to acknowledge Kublai Khan's authority. They had used the Civil War as an opportunity to assert their independence, and they were not about to give it up now that the fighting was over. The Golden Horde, established by Batu Khan in the Western Territories, had already begun to adapt to local conditions. The Mongol rulers were learning Russian, converting to Orthodox Christianity, and intermarrying with local noble families. They maintained their Mongol identity, but it was increasingly influenced by Slavic culture and Byzantine political traditions. The Ilkhanate in Persia was undergoing a similar transformation. The Mongol rulers were adopting Persian customs, converting to Islam, and patronizing Persian art and literature. They were becoming Persian kings who happened to be of Mongol descent rather than Mongol Khans who happened to rule Persian territories. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained more traditionally Mongol in its customs and lifestyle, but even it was beginning to fragment into smaller units based on tribal and regional loyalties. The vast distances and diverse populations of Central Asia made unified rule increasingly difficult to maintain. What had once been a single empire stretching across Eurasia was now 4 separate khanates, each pursuing its own policies, each gradually adapting to local conditions and losing its distinctly Mongol character. The dream of universal empire that had driven Genghis Khan and his successors was dead, replaced by a more conventional system of competing regional powers. Kublai Khan, now calling himself Emperor of China and founding the Yuan dynasty, completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in 1279, but his attempts to expand beyond China met with mixed success. His invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 were disasters, defeated by storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, divine winds sent by the gods to protect their islands. The Japanese campaigns revealed the limitations of Mongol power when faced with natural obstacles and determined resistance. The Mongol war machine that had conquered continental empires proved unable to project power across water barriers or to maintain supply lines across hostile seas. His campaigns in Southeast Asia were more successful but also more costly than traditional Mongol warfare. The jungle terrain of Vietnam and Java was unsuitable for cavalry warfare, and the Mongol armies found themselves fighting long, grinding campaigns against enemies who used guerrilla tactics and were supported by local populations that had no desire to be conquered. These campaigns demonstrated that the age of easy Mongol conquest was over. The remaining unconquered territories were either protected by natural barriers that Mongol armies could not easily overcome, or they were inhabited by peoples who had learned from the fate of earlier victims and had developed effective countermeasures. Meanwhile, the other Mongol khanates were facing their own challenges. The Golden Horde in Russia was gradually being absorbed into the local political system, with Mongol Khans adopting Orthodox Christianity and Russian customs. The process was slow but inexorable. Each generation became more Russian and less Mongol. The Ilkhanate in Persia was converting to Islam and becoming indistinguishable from other Middle Eastern dynasties. The Mongol rulers patronized Islamic art and architecture, employed Persian administrators, and gradually abandoned the nomadic lifestyle that had been the source of their ancestors' strength. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia was fragmenting into smaller units that bore little resemblance to the original Mongol Confederation. Local strongmen established their own domains, tribal leaders asserted their independence, and the unity that had once characterized Mongol rule gave way to the familiar pattern of Central Asian political fragmentation. The transformation was not just political, but cultural. The Mongol language was being replaced by Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and Russian in different parts of the former empire. Mongol customs were giving way to local traditions. The nomadic lifestyle that had been the source of Mongol military advantage was being abandoned in favor of settled agriculture and urban life. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire as a unified political entity had ceased to exist. What remained were the successor states, each following its own path, each gradually losing the characteristics that had made the original Mongol conquests possible. But the impact of those conquests would endure long after the empire itself had disappeared. The trade routes that the Mongols had established continued to function. The technologies they had spread continued to influence human development. The precedent they had set for governing diverse populations under a single authority would inspire future empire builders for centuries to come. The fracture of the Mongol Empire marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in world history. The age of nomadic supremacy was over, but the age of global connection that the Mongols had initiated would continue to develop in new forms and under new leadership. Even as the political unity of the Mongol Empire was dissolving, its most lasting contribution to world history was reaching its full flowering. For the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, a single political authority controlled the entire length of the Silk Road from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, creating unprecedented opportunities for trade, cultural exchange, and the transmission of ideas that would reshape human civilization. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was not peace in the sense of an absence of warfare, but rather the kind of stability that comes from overwhelming military superiority and effective administration. Merchants could travel from Venice to Beijing under the protection of Mongol law, secure in the knowledge that banditry would be severely punished, and that contracts would be enforced regardless of the ethnic or religious background of the parties involved. This commercial revolution had effects that went far beyond simple trade. Technologies that had been confined to specific regions began to spread across Eurasia with unprecedented speed. Gunpowder, invented in China, reached Europe via the Mongol trade routes and would eventually transform warfare throughout the world. The printing press, paper money, the magnetic compass, all of these innovations spread along the paths carved out by Mongol conquest. The compass, originally developed by Chinese navigators for use on rivers and coastal waters, was adapted by Arab and European sailors for ocean navigation. This single technology would make possible the age of exploration that would connect the old world with the new and establish the first truly global trade networks. Paper money, another Chinese innovation, was adopted throughout the Mongol Empire and eventually spread to Europe, where it would revolutionize commerce and finance. The concept of credit, a value that existed independently of physical objects, was one of the foundations of modern capitalism. But perhaps more important than any specific technology was the exchange of ideas. Islamic mathematics and astronomy reached China, where they were combined with Chinese innovations to create new advances in science and engineering. Chinese medicine and philosophy reached Europe, where they influenced the development of medieval scholasticism and Renaissance humanism. Indian numerals and algebraic concepts spread throughout the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, where they would become the foundation of modern mathematics. The Mongol Empire had created the first truly global information network, centuries before the age of exploration would connect the old world with the new. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices could spread from one end of Eurasia to the other in a matter of months or years rather than centuries. The scale of this exchange was staggering. Marco Polo's famous journey to the court of Kublai Khan was just one of thousands of similar expeditions undertaken by merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and scholars during the height of Mongol power. The Yuan dynasty capital at Beijing became a cosmopolitan city where Europeans, Arabs, Persians, and Indians mingled with Chinese and Mongols in a cultural melting pot unlike anything the world had ever seen. The city itself was a marvel of urban planning and international architecture. The Mongol rulers had employed architects and engineers from across their empire to create a capital that would reflect their global dominion. Chinese pagodas stood alongside Persian gardens, Islamic mosques neighbored Buddhist temples, and European merchants conducted business in markets that sold goods from every corner of the known world. This cultural exchange was not always peaceful or voluntary. The Mongols had a systematic policy of relocating skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators from conquered territories to other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. Chinese engineers found themselves building siege engines in Persia. Persian astronomers were relocated to Beijing to work on calendar reform. European craftsmen were brought to Karakoram to work on imperial projects. These forced relocations, while traumatic for the individuals involved, had profound effects on the development of human knowledge and technology. Techniques and ideas that had been confined to specific regions were suddenly available throughout the empire. The cross-fertilization of different traditions led to innovations that would not have been possible in isolation. But voluntary exchange was equally important. The Mongol Empire's policy of religious tolerance meant that missionaries of all faiths could travel freely throughout the empire. Nestorian Christians established churches from Baghdad to Beijing, creating a network of Christian communities that stretched across Asia. Buddhist monks carried their teachings from India to Eastern Europe, establishing monasteries and schools that preserved and transmitted Buddhist philosophy and practice. Islamic scholars found patrons in the courts of Mongol Khans who had never heard of the Prophet Muhammad, and they established madrasas and libraries that became centers of learning throughout the empire. Jewish merchants and scholars traveled the trade routes, establishing communities and synagogues that connected the Jewish diaspora in ways that had never been possible before. The economic impact of this exchange was revolutionary. Cities that had been regional centers became international hubs. Samarkand, Bukhara, and other Central Asian cities experienced a golden age as they became crucial links in the transcontinental trade network. These cities were transformed from provincial capitals into cosmopolitan centers where merchants from dozens of different countries conducted business in multiple languages and currencies. Venice and Genoa grew wealthy as the western terminals of trade routes that stretched across the known world. The Italian city-states became the financial centers of Europe, developing banking and credit systems that could handle the complex transactions involved in transcontinental commerce. The Mongol Empire had also standardized weights, measures, and currencies across vast distances, making trade easier and more efficient. A merchant could travel from the Black Sea to the South China Sea using the same basic commercial practices and legal frameworks throughout the journey. But perhaps the most important effect was psychological. For the first time in human history, people began to think of the world as a single, interconnected system, rather than a collection of isolated regions. The Mongol Empire had created not just political unity, but a kind of global consciousness that would outlast the empire itself. This new worldview would have profound consequences for the future. The age of exploration that began in the 15th century was motivated in part by European desires to re-establish direct contact with Asia after the collapse of the Mongol trade routes. Columbus was looking for a new route to the Indies when he stumbled upon the Americas. The Portuguese exploration of the African coast was driven by the desire to bypass the Ottoman Empire and reach the spice markets of Asia directly. The maps that guided these explorations were based on knowledge accumulated during the Mongol period. European cartographers had access to Chinese and Islamic geographical knowledge that had been transmitted along the Mongol trade routes. The very concept of a spherical Earth, which made ocean exploration possible, had been confirmed by scholars working in the cosmopolitan environment of the Mongol Empire. In a very real sense, the Mongol Empire had created the first global economy, and its collapse would drive the European powers to create the second one through maritime exploration and colonial expansion. The vision of a connected world that the Mongols had realized through land-based conquest would be recreated by European powers through sea-based empire. The technologies that made the age of exploration possible, the compass, improved map-making, better ship design, gunpowder weapons, had all been developed or refined during the Mongol period. The financial instruments that made long-distance trade profitable, credit systems, insurance, standardized currencies, had been pioneered in the cosmopolitan markets of the Mongol Empire. Even the cultural attitudes that made exploration and colonization possible, the belief that different peoples could be governed under a single authority, the confidence that vast distances could be overcome through superior organization and technology, the assumption that trade and conquest could go hand in hand, had been demonstrated on a continental scale by the Mongol Empire. The Silk Roads that the Mongols had protected and expanded would eventually be replaced by sea routes that connected Europe directly with Asia and the Americas. But the precedent they had established, of a world connected by trade, united by common interests, and governed by universal principles, would continue to influence human development for centuries to come. The Mongol Empire's influence on world history extends far beyond its military conquests, or even its role in facilitating trade and cultural exchange. In many ways, the Mongols pioneered concepts and institutions that would not become widespread until the modern era, making them inadvertent architects of the world we live in today. Consider their approach to governance. The Mongol Empire was perhaps the first truly meritocratic state in world history. While traditional societies were organized around hereditary aristocracies or religious hierarchies, the Mongols promoted individuals based on ability and loyalty rather than birth or social status. A shepherd who showed tactical brilliance could become a general. A captured enemy who demonstrated administrative skills could become a governor. This meritocratic principle was revolutionary in its implications. It suggested that human worth was not determined by ancestry or divine appointment, but by individual achievement and contribution to society. This idea would eventually become one of the foundations of modern democratic thought, though it would take centuries for it to be fully realized. The Mongol system of promotion based on merit created opportunities for social mobility that were unprecedented in the medieval world. Men of humble origins could rise to positions of great power and influence if they demonstrated the necessary skills and loyalty. This created a dynamic, competitive environment that encouraged innovation and excellence. This meritocratic principle extended to their military organization as well. The decimal system that organized Mongol armies, units of 10, 100,000, and 10,000, was based on efficiency rather than traditional tribal or clan structures. Soldiers were promoted based on performance in battle, not on their family connections or social background. The military organization of the Mongol Empire was remarkably modern in its emphasis on standardization, training, and professional development. Officers were expected to master not just the arts of war, but also logistics, administration, and diplomacy. The Mongol military was perhaps the first truly professional army in world history. The Mongols were also pioneers in what we would now call international law. The Yasa, the legal code established by Genghis Khan, applied equally to all subjects of the empire, regardless of their ethnic or religious background. This was revolutionary in an age when different communities typically lived under different legal systems, when justice was often a matter of local custom rather than universal principle. The Yasa established principles that would later become fundamental to modern legal systems: equality before the law, protection of property rights, freedom of religion, and the sanctity of diplomatic immunity. These concepts were not fully developed in the Mongol period, but the precedents they established would influence legal development for centuries to come. Their postal system, the Yam, was perhaps the most efficient communication network in the pre-modern world. Messages could travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks, a speed that would not be matched again until the invention of the telegraph. This system required a level of organization and standardization that prefigured modern bureaucratic states. The Yam was more than just a communication system. It was a model for how large-scale organizations could coordinate their activities across vast distances. The principles of standardization, redundancy, and systematic organization that made the Yam possible would later be applied to modern postal services, telegraph networks, and eventually the Internet. The Mongol approach to religious tolerance was equally advanced. While most medieval states were organized around a single religious identity, the Mongol Empire included Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Confucians, and traditional shamanists, all living under the same political authority. The Mongols not only tolerated this diversity, but actively encouraged it, seeing religious competition as a source of strength rather than weakness. This policy of religious tolerance was based on practical considerations. It was easier to govern diverse populations if you didn't try to force them to change their beliefs. But it also reflected a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between religion and politics. The Mongols understood that religious diversity could be a source of innovation and creativity, that different traditions could learn from each other and contribute to the common good. This tolerance extended to intellectual life as well. The Mongol courts became centers of learning where scholars from different traditions could interact and exchange ideas. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the Imperial Academy in Beijing, the libraries of Samarkand, these institutions fostered a kind of intellectual cosmopolitanism that would not be seen again until the European Enlightenment. The Mongol Empire was perhaps the first truly multicultural state in world history, a political entity that successfully integrated dozens of different peoples and traditions under a single authority. This achievement would not be matched again until the modern era, and even today, few states have managed to create the kind of inclusive, diverse society that the Mongols pioneered. But perhaps the Mongols' most important contribution to modernity was their demonstration that vast, diverse populations could be governed as a single political unit. The Roman Empire had shown that this was possible in the Mediterranean world, but the Mongol Empire proved that it could be done on a truly continental scale, encompassing not just different ethnic groups but entirely different civilizations. This precedent would be crucial for the development of the modern world system. The European colonial empires that emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries were built on the assumption that diverse populations could be governed from a single center, an assumption that had been validated by Mongol success centuries earlier. The modern nation-state, with its emphasis on centralized authority, standardized laws, and unified administration, owes much to the Mongol precedent. The idea that a single government could effectively rule over millions of people speaking different languages and practicing different religions was first demonstrated on a large scale by the Mongol Empire. Even the concept of globalization, which we think of as a distinctly modern phenomenon, has its roots in the Mongol period. The integration of Eurasian trade networks, the standardization of commercial practices across vast distances, the creation of the first truly international economy. All of these developments began under Mongol rule. The Mongols also pioneered what we might call cultural globalization. The movement of people, ideas, and technologies across the Mongol Empire created a kind of world culture that transcended local boundaries, A merchant in Venice might wear silk from China, use paper money invented in China, and navigate by a compass also invented in China, all thanks to the trade networks established by Mongol conquest. This cultural exchange was not just one way. European, Islamic, and other traditions also influenced Chinese and Mongol culture. The result was a kind of global synthesis that prefigured the cultural mixing that characterizes our modern world. The Mongol Empire also demonstrated the possibility of governing through consent rather than coercion. While the initial conquests were certainly violent, the long-term success of Mongol rule depended on the cooperation of local populations. The Mongols understood that they could not govern their vast empire through force alone. They needed to create systems that people would accept and support. This insight would eventually become one of the foundations of modern democratic theory. The idea that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the governed, that rulers must serve the interests of their subjects rather than simply exploiting them, was first implemented on a large scale by the Mongol Empire. In many ways, the Mongol Empire was the first truly global civilization, a political and economic system that encompassed most of the inhabited world and created connections that would endure long after the empire itself had disappeared. The modern world, with its emphasis on global trade, cultural exchange, and international cooperation, is in many ways the fulfillment of the Mongol vision. The decline of the Mongol Empire was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation, a slow dissolution that took place over more than a century. Like a great river that eventually splits into smaller streams, the unified empire gradually separated into distinct regional powers, each adapting to local conditions and losing its connection to the original Mongol identity. The process of decline was different in each part of the former empire, reflecting the diverse challenges and opportunities that the Mongol rulers faced in different regions. In some areas, the transformation was relatively peaceful, with Mongol elites gradually assimilating into local cultures. In others, it was marked by violence and upheaval as competing factions struggled for control. In China, the Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan lasted until 1368, when it was overthrown by the Ming dynasty in a rebellion that combined Chinese nationalism with social revolution. The Mongol rulers had become increasingly Chinese in their outlook and methods, but they had never fully integrated with Chinese society. They remained a foreign ruling class, and when economic problems and natural disasters weakened their position, they found themselves without the popular support necessary to maintain power. The fall of the Yuan dynasty was precipitated by a series of natural disasters that struck China in the mid-14th century. Floods, droughts, and famines created widespread suffering and social unrest. The Mongol government, weakened by internal divisions and corruption, proved unable to respond effectively to these crises. The rebellion that eventually overthrew the Yuan dynasty began among the peasants and urban poor who had suffered most from the natural disasters and economic disruption. But it was led by educated Chinese who had been excluded from power by the Mongol preference for foreign administrators. The combination of popular discontent and elite leadership proved irresistible. The fall of the Yuan dynasty marked the end of Mongol rule in China, but it did not mean the end of Mongol influence. Many Mongol nobles and administrators remained in China, gradually assimilating into Chinese society. Mongol military techniques and administrative practices were adopted by the Ming dynasty. The cultural exchange that had flourished under Mongol rule continued, though in more limited forms. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Yuan was in many ways a reaction against Mongol rule, emphasizing Chinese cultural purity and traditional values, but it also inherited many of the innovations and institutions that had been developed during the Mongol period, including the examination system for selecting officials, the postal relay network, and the emphasis on trade and commerce. In Persia, the Ilkhanate lasted until 1335, when it fragmented into smaller successor states. The Mongol rulers had converted to Islam and adopted Persian customs. But they had never developed strong institutions capable of holding the diverse populations of the region together. When the last Ilkhan died without a clear successor, the realm simply fell apart, replaced by a patchwork of local dynasties and tribal confederations. The fragmentation of the Ilkhanate was accelerated by the Black Death, which struck the Middle East in the mid-14th century and caused massive population decline and economic disruption. The weakened Mongol government proved unable to maintain control over its territories, and local strongmen stepped in to fill the power vacuum. The successor states that emerged from the collapse of the Ilkhanate were smaller and weaker than the original Mongol Empire, but they preserved many of the cultural and administrative innovations that had been developed during the Mongol period. Persian art and literature flourished under these new dynasties, and the tradition of religious tolerance that the Mongols had established continued to influence Middle Eastern politics. The Golden Horde in Russia proved more durable, lasting in various forms until the late 15th century, but it too underwent a gradual transformation, becoming less Mongol and more Russian with each generation. The Khans converted to Islam, adopted sedentary lifestyles, and increasingly relied on Russian administrators and soldiers. The transformation of the Golden Horde was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. The Mongol rulers began by adopting Russian administrative practices and legal systems, finding them more effective for governing a settled population than traditional nomadic methods. They also began to intermarry with Russian noble families, creating a mixed elite that combined Mongol and Russian traditions. By the time Ivan the Great of Moscow finally threw off the Mongol yoke in 1480, the Golden Horde had already become more of a Russian principality than a Mongol Khanate. The final break was more symbolic than practical, representing the emergence of a unified Russian state rather than the defeat of a foreign occupier. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia was the most fragmented of the successor states, splitting into numerous smaller entities that fought constantly among themselves. Some of these maintained nomadic traditions longer than the others, but even they gradually adopted the customs and languages of their settled subjects. The fragmentation of the Chagatai Khanate was due partly to the geographical challenges of governing Central Asia, with its vast distances and diverse populations, and partly to the traditional Mongol emphasis on tribal autonomy. Without a strong central authority to hold them together, the various tribes and clans gradually asserted their independence. The last great flowering of Mongol power came in the 14th century with the rise of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Though not himself a Mongol, Timur claimed descent from Genghis Khan and consciously modeled his empire on Mongol precedents. His conquests, which stretched from India to the Mediterranean, briefly recreated something resembling the old Mongol Empire, but his realm collapsed shortly after his death in 1405. Timur's empire was in many ways an attempt to recreate the Mongol Empire using traditional nomadic methods, but it proved unsustainable in the changed conditions of the late medieval period. The rise of gunpowder weapons, the development of more sophisticated defensive techniques, and the emergence of stronger centralized states made the old Mongol tactics less effective. By the beginning of the 15th century, the Mongol Empire as a political entity had ceased to exist. What remained were the successor states, each following its own path, each gradually losing the characteristics that had made the original Mongol conquests possible. The age of nomadic supremacy was ending, replaced by the age of gunpowder empires and maritime exploration. But the memory of Mongol power endured. In Russia, the Mongol yoke became a defining experience in national consciousness, a period of foreign domination that shaped Russian attitudes toward both Asia and the West. The experience of Mongol rule contributed to the development of Russian autocracy, with its emphasis on centralized authority and its suspicion of foreign influence. In China, the Yuan dynasty was remembered as a time of foreign rule, but also of cultural flowering and international connection. The Mongol period was seen as an aberration in Chinese history, but also as a time when China had been connected to the wider world in ways that would not be repeated until the modern era. In the Islamic world, the destruction of Baghdad remained a traumatic memory, but the Mongol period was also remembered as a time of intellectual exchange and artistic achievement. The cosmopolitan culture that had flourished under Mongol rule became a model for later Islamic empires. The Mongols themselves retreated to their original homeland in Mongolia, where they maintained their traditional nomadic lifestyle for several more centuries. But they too were eventually affected by the changes sweeping across Eurasia. The introduction of Buddhism in the 16th century transformed Mongol society, creating a peaceful, contemplative culture very different from the warrior ethos of Genghis Khan's time. The great empire was gone, but its legacy lived on in the institutions, technologies, and ideas that had spread along the trade routes it had created and protected. The modern world, with its emphasis on global connection and cultural exchange, is in many ways the fulfillment of the Mongol vision, achieved through different means but guided by the same fundamental insight, that humanity is one people, living under one sky, destined to be united rather than divided. Today, more than 7 centuries after the death of Genghis Khan, the influence of the Mongol Empire continues to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. The political map of Eurasia still bears the imprint of Mongol conquest and administration. The cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule laid the groundwork for the global civilization we inhabit today. Consider the modern nation-states that emerged from the territories once ruled by the Mongols. Russia's expansion across Siberia to the Pacific followed routes first established by Mongol armies and administrators. The Russian Empire's methods of governing diverse ethnic and religious populations were heavily influenced by Mongol precedents. Even today, the Russian Federation's approach to managing its vast, multicultural territory reflects lessons learned during the centuries of Mongol rule. The Chinese concept of a unified multi-ethnic empire owes much to the precedent set by the Yuan dynasty. The idea that a single government could effectively rule over dozens of different peoples speaking different languages and practicing different religions was first demonstrated in China by the Mongols. Modern China's approach to governing Tibet, Xinjiang, and other minority regions reflects this Mongol legacy. Even the borders of modern Mongolia reflect the administrative divisions created by Genghis Khan's successors. The Mongolian People's Republic, and later the Democratic Mongolia that emerged after 1990, occupy roughly the same territory that served as the heartland of the original Mongol Empire. The technologies that define our modern world, from gunpowder to printing, from paper money to the magnetic compass, all spread along the trade routes protected by Mongol power. The scientific revolution that began in Europe during the Renaissance was built on knowledge that had been preserved and transmitted by Islamic scholars working under Mongol patronage. Gunpowder, which the Mongols helped spread from China to Europe, revolutionized warfare and made possible the age of European expansion. The printing press, another Chinese invention that spread westward during the Mongol period, made possible the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. Paper money, first developed in China and adopted throughout the Mongol Empire, became the foundation of modern financial systems. The concept of credit, of value that exists independently of physical objects, was one of the key innovations that made capitalism possible. The magnetic compass, which spread from China to the Islamic world and then to Europe during the Mongol period, made possible the age of exploration that connected the old world with the new. Without the compass, Columbus might never have reached the Americas, and the modern global economy might never have developed. The very concept of globalization, which we think of as distinctly modern, has its roots in the Mongol period. The integration of Eurasian trade networks, the standardization of commercial practices across vast distances, the creation of the first truly international economy, all of these developments began under Mongol rule. The modern global economy, with its emphasis on free trade, standardized currencies, and international law, is in many ways a recreation of the economic system that the Mongols established across Eurasia. The World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and other international economic institutions are attempting to achieve on a global scale what the Mongols achieved on a continental scale 7 centuries ago. But perhaps the most important Mongol legacy is conceptual rather than material. The Mongol Empire demonstrated that it was possible to govern vast, diverse populations as a single political unit, that different cultures and religions could coexist under a common authority, that merit could triumph over birth in the allocation of power and responsibility. These ideas, revolutionary in the 13th century, have become the foundation of the modern world order. The United Nations, with its emphasis on international cooperation and cultural diversity, is based on principles that were first implemented on a large scale by the Mongol Empire. The European Union, which has created a single economic and political space encompassing dozens of different nations and cultures, is attempting to achieve something similar to what the Mongols accomplished across Eurasia. The challenges are different. The EU must deal with democratic institutions and national sovereignty in ways that the Mongols did not. But the fundamental goal is the same: to create unity without destroying diversity. The global economy, with its emphasis on free trade and cultural exchange, reflects the Mongol vision of a world without barriers to commerce and communication. The Internet, which connects people across continents in ways that would have amazed even the Mongols, is the ultimate fulfillment of their dream of instant communication across vast distances. The Mongol approach to religious tolerance prefigured the secular states of the modern era. Their understanding that religious diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness has become one of the fundamental principles of modern democratic societies. Their meritocratic principles influence the development of modern bureaucracies and professional armies. The idea that positions should be filled based on ability rather than birth or social status is now taken for granted in most developed countries, but it was revolutionary when the Mongols first implemented it. Their postal system provided a model for the communication networks that bind our globalized world together. The Pony Express, the telegraph, the telephone, and the Internet are all descendants of the Yam, the Mongol postal relay system that connected the far corners of their empire. Even their military innovations continue to influence modern warfare. The Mongol emphasis on mobility, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare can be seen in contemporary military doctrines. Their ability to coordinate operations across vast distances using primitive communication systems prefigured the network-centric warfare of the digital age. The concept of shock and awe, which has become a central element of modern military strategy, was first developed by the Mongols. They understood that the psychological impact of overwhelming force could be more important than the physical destruction it caused. But the Mongol legacy is not entirely positive. Their conquests also demonstrated the terrible destructive power that could be unleashed by a militarized society with superior technology and organization. The genocidal campaigns against the Khwarezmids and other enemies provided a template for the total wars of the modern era. The environmental impact of Mongol conquest was also significant. The destruction of irrigation systems in Central Asia and Persia led to the desertification of regions that had been fertile for millennia. The demographic catastrophe caused by Mongol warfare may have contributed to climate change by reducing human populations and allowing forests to regrow in abandoned agricultural areas. Yet for all their destructiveness, the Mongols also created something unprecedented in human history: a truly global civilization that connected East and West, North and South, in a single economic and cultural system. They showed that the barriers between civilizations were not insurmountable, that human societies could be integrated on a scale previously thought impossible. In our own age of globalization, As we struggle with questions of cultural diversity, international governance, and economic integration, we might do well to remember the Mongol example. They faced similar challenges 7 centuries ago and found solutions that, while imperfect, allowed them to create the largest contiguous empire in human history. The storm that began on the Mongolian steppes in the 12th century has long since passed, but its effects continue to reverberate through our world. Every time we use paper money, every time we navigate by compass, every time we benefit from the exchange of ideas across cultural boundaries, we are experiencing echoes of the Mongol Empire. In the interconnected world of today, where information travels at the speed of light and goods flow across continents in a matter of days, we are living in the fulfillment of the Mongol vision, a world without borders, where distance is no barrier to communication and commerce, where the entire earth has become a single, vast pasture for human ambition and achievement. The Mongols dreamed of a world united under one ruler, governed by one law, connected by one great network of trade and communication. That dream was never fully realized in their time, but it continues to inspire us today as we work to build a global civilization that can encompass all of humanity while respecting the diversity that makes us strong. As we reach the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire, it's worth reflecting on what this extraordinary chapter in human history can teach us about power, ambition, and the forces that shape civilizations. The story of the Mongols is not just a tale of conquest and empire, it is a meditation on the nature of human potential, on what becomes possible when vision meets opportunity, when individual genius aligns with historical necessity. The Mongol Empire was, in many ways, an accident of history. It emerged from the collision of a particular set of circumstances, the fragmentation of China, the weakness of the Islamic world, the political divisions of Europe, with the extraordinary vision and organizational genius of a single man. Without Genghis Khan, the scattered tribes of Mongolia might have remained just another collection of nomadic peoples, significant only to their immediate neighbors, forgotten by history, except as a footnote in the chronicles of their more powerful neighbors. But Genghis Khan was not just a great conqueror. He was a great synthesizer, a man who could take the best elements from different cultures and combine them into something new and more powerful. The Mongol military system combined the mobility of steppe warfare with the siege techniques of Chinese engineering. Mongol administration blended nomadic flexibility with the bureaucratic sophistication of settled civilizations. Mongol law merged tribal customs with universal principles of justice. This ability to learn and adapt was perhaps the Mongols' greatest strength. They were not bound by tradition or ideology in the way that many of their enemies were. They were willing to adopt any practice, any technology, any idea that would make them more effective. This pragmatic approach to governance and warfare gave them enormous advantages over more rigid societies. The Mongol Empire succeeded because it was built on principles that transcended cultural boundaries. Merit mattered more than birth. Loyalty was rewarded regardless of ethnic or religious background. Trade and communication were encouraged rather than restricted. These were revolutionary ideas in the 13th century, and they remain powerful today. But it also contained the seeds of their eventual decline. As the Mongols adapted to the cultures they conquered, they gradually lost the characteristics that had made their conquests possible. The warrior ethos that had driven them across Eurasia was replaced by the administrative requirements of governing settled populations. The mobility that had been their greatest military asset became less important as they established permanent capitals and bureaucratic structures. The transformation was inevitable, perhaps even necessary. An empire based purely on conquest and plunder could not have lasted as long as the Mongol Empire did. But the price of stability was the loss of the dynamic energy that had created the empire in the first place. This pattern, the rise of a dynamic force, its transformation through success, and its eventual decline, is one of the recurring themes of world history. We can see it in the Roman Empire, which began as a city-state of citizen soldiers and ended as a bureaucratic monarchy defended by barbarian mercenaries. We can see it in the Islamic Empire, which began as a movement of desert warriors and evolved into a sophisticated urban civilization. We can see it in the European colonial empires, which began as commercial ventures and became vast administrative systems. The Mongol Empire followed this same trajectory, but on a scale and at a speed that dwarfed all previous examples. In less than 2 centuries, they created the largest contiguous empire in human history, transformed the political and economic structure of Eurasia, and then fragmented into successor states that bore little resemblance to the original nomadic confederation. Yet their legacy endures. The world we inhabit today, interconnected, diverse, constantly changing, is in many ways the world that the Mongols created. They showed that it was possible to think beyond the boundaries of tribe and nation, to imagine a truly global civilization that could encompass all of humanity. This vision, imperfectly realized in their own time, continues to inspire and challenge us today. As we face the problems of our own globalized world, climate change, economic inequality, cultural conflict, we might find wisdom in the Mongol example. They faced similar challenges of scale and diversity, and while their solutions were often brutal, they were also remarkably effective. The Mongols understood that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that different cultures and traditions could contribute to a common enterprise without losing their distinctive characteristics. They created the first truly multicultural empire, a political system that successfully integrated dozens of different peoples under a single authority. They also understood that effective governance required both centralized authority and local autonomy, that a vast empire could not be ruled through rigid uniformity, but needed flexibility and adaptation to local conditions. This insight remains relevant today as we struggle to create international institutions that can address global challenges while respecting national sovereignty and cultural diversity. The eternal blue sky that the Mongols worshipped as their supreme deity still arches over the steppes of Mongolia, unchanged by the rise and fall of empires. Beneath it, the descendants of Genghis Khan's warriors tend their herds and tell stories of the time when their ancestors ruled the world. The great storm has passed, but the memory remains, a reminder of what human ambition and organizational genius can accomplish when they are combined with the right circumstances and the will to act. In the end, the Mongol Empire was both a culmination and a beginning, the last great nomadic empire and the first truly global civilization. It marked the end of one age of human history and the beginning of another, the transition from a world of isolated civilizations to the interconnected world we know today. The storm that began on the Mongolian steppes 8 centuries ago has never really ended. It has simply transformed, becoming the winds of change that continue to reshape our world. The Mongol vision of a unified humanity living under one sky, connected by trade and communication, governed by universal principles of justice and merit, remains as relevant today as it was in the 13th century. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy for an empire that was always in motion, always changing, always reaching toward the horizon where the earth meets the eternal sky. The Mongols taught us that no distance is too great, no barrier too high, no dream too ambitious for those who have the vision to see beyond the immediate horizon, and the courage to pursue their destiny across the vast steppes of possibility. The great Khan is gone, but the empire he built lives on in every connection between East and West, in every exchange of ideas across cultural boundaries, in every reminder that we are all part of one human story, written beneath the same eternal sky. The Mongols showed us that the world is one vast steppe, waiting to be crossed by those bold enough to mount their horses and ride toward the setting sun, carrying with them the dreams and ambitions that make us human. In our own time, as we stand at the threshold of new frontiers, digital, spatial, perhaps even cosmic, we carry with us the echo of hoofbeats across ancient grasslands, the memory of a people who dared to believe that the entire world could be their home, that all of humanity could be united under one vast, eternal sky. And so ends our journey through the rise and fall of the greatest land empire the world has ever known. The Mongol storm swept across Eurasia like wildfire, connecting civilizations, spreading technologies, and reshaping the very foundations of human society. From the felt tents of Mongolia to the marble palaces of Beijing, from the steppes of Central Asia to the forests of Russia, their influence touched every corner of the known world. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of endless grasslands beneath an infinite sky, of the thunder of hoofbeats across ancient trade routes, of the moment when a collection of nomadic tribes became the architects of our interconnected world. The Mongols showed us that no barrier is insurmountable, no distance too great, no dream too ambitious for those with the vision to see beyond the horizon. The great Khan is gone, but the empire he built lives on in every connection between East and West, in every exchange of ideas across cultural boundaries, in every reminder that we are all part of one human story, written beneath the same eternal sky. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes the greatest changes in history begin with a single voice calling across the vastness, gathering the scattered tribes of humanity into something greater than the sum of its parts.